When billionaire CEO Marcus Henley stepped out of his Bentley and saw the shivering flower vendor, he never expected to recognize the face of the homeless girl who had donated her only blanket to save his life 20 years ago. Before we dive into this incredible story of fate and redemption, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The first drops of November rain struck the gleaming glass facade of Henley Tower with the persistence of destiny itself. Marcus Henley stood beneath the granite overhang of his company's Manhattan headquarters, watching his driver navigate the suddenly congested streets in search of a safe pickup zone. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the unconscious authority of a man who had never needed to question his place in the world. His charcoal Tom Ford suit, tailored to perfection, remained immaculate despite the chaos of the unexpected downpour. The Patek Philippe on his wrist, a graduation gift from Harvard Business School 20 years prior, caught the reflection of the building's LED displays as he checked the time with practiced impatience. "Mr. Henley," his assistant's voice crackled through his earpiece, "your car is delayed approximately 8 minutes due to the weather conditions. Shall I reschedule the Meridian Capital meeting?" Marcus pressed the device with a manicured finger, his attention momentarily diverted by the controlled pandemonium unfolding on Park Avenue. Executives and tourists alike scrambled for shelter, their expensive umbrellas proving inadequate against the wind-whipped precipitation. "No changes to the schedule, Jennifer. I'll wait." The irony wasn't lost on him that 8 minutes of inconvenience constituted his most pressing concern of the day. In the boardroom he'd just vacated, Henley Enterprises had finalized the acquisition of a renewable energy startup for $2.3 billion, a transaction that would expand their portfolio into sustainable technologies while generating returns his shareholders would celebrate for quarters to come. The morning's Wall Street Journal had featured his photograph above an article chronicling his company's unprecedented growth trajectory, describing him as the architect of modern corporate responsibility. Yet here he stood, frustrated by a brief delay in his meticulously orchestrated schedule. Thunder rumbled overhead, vibrating through the steel and glass canyon of Midtown Manhattan. The storm had arrived with the sudden ferocity that characterized late autumn weather in the city, transforming the orderly rhythm of business into improvised chaos. Steam rose from the heated pavement as rain struck the concrete in sheets, creating a misty barrier between the sheltered entrance and the street beyond. Marcus adjusted his Italian leather briefcase, scanning the sidewalk for his distinctive black Bentley. His eyes moved methodically across the scene. Harried commuters checking their phones, a homeless veteran with a cardboard sign seeking shelter beneath a construction awning, tourists photographing the dramatic sky through rain-streaked windows. The urban tableau was familiar, yet somehow different in the strange lighting created by the storm, more vulnerable, more human than the usual crisp efficiency of Manhattan commerce. It was then that he saw her. Across the avenue, partially obscured by the curtain of rain, a slight figure hunched over a small cart filled with flowers. The woman appeared immune to the downpour, continuing to arrange her wilted inventory with methodical care, even as water streamed from her thin jacket. There was something in her posture, a quiet dignity maintained, despite obviously difficult circumstances, that made Marcus pause his search for the Bentley. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, her frame fragile beneath clothing that had seen better seasons. Dark hair, streaked with premature gray, was pulled back in a practical ponytail that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Her skin, weathered by years of outdoor work, spoke of struggles that Marcus's world rarely acknowledged. Yet she moved with purposeful grace, adjusting the stems of daffodils and roses that had clearly passed their prime, treating each flower as though it possessed inherent value regardless of its commercial appeal. A businessman in an expensive overcoat hurried past her cart without a glance, followed by a group of tourists more interested in photographing the dramatic skyline than noticing the woman trying to make a living beneath it. Marcus found himself studying her face, searching for something he couldn't quite identify. The distance and rain made details difficult to discern, but an inexplicable recognition tugged at the edges of his memory. Not recent recognition, but something deeper, older, more profound. The flower vendor looked up suddenly, as though sensing his attention. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the busy street, and Marcus felt an electric shock of familiarity that had nothing to do with casual encounters in Manhattan's business district. Her gaze was direct but gentle, carrying a depth of experience that seemed incongruous with her modest circumstances. In that instant, time seemed to collapse, decades compressing into a single moment of impossible recognition. Marcus stepped forward unconsciously, his briefcase forgotten at his side. The rain had intensified, turning the street into a river of reflected lights and rushing water, but he barely noticed the precipitation soaking through his expensive jacket. Something about this woman, something about her eyes, her posture, the way she held herself despite the storm, pierced through 28 years of accumulated wealth and responsibility to touch a memory he had carefully preserved in the deepest chambers of his heart. His phone buzzed with a text from his driver, but Marcus ignored it. The Meridian Capital meeting, the quarterly projections, the renewable energy acquisitional of it, faded into irrelevance as he stared at the slight figure across Park Avenue. She had returned her attention to the flowers, but the moment of eye contact had triggered something profound in Marcus's carefully organized mind. Chicago, 1994. The memory surfaced with startling clarity, as vivid as though it had occurred yesterday rather than decades ago. He had been 12 years old, running through a winter storm not unlike this one, driven by adolescent fury and privileged rebellion. The details came flooding back: the fight with his father, the impulsive decision to leave Ashford Preparatory Academy, the near-fatal mistake that had nearly cost him his life. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over his face as the past reasserted itself with overwhelming force. In his mind, he was no longer a 42-year-old billionaire CEO standing outside his corporate headquarters. He was a terrified child, lost and freezing in an alley behind a Chicago diner, convinced he was going to die alone in the darkness. And then, she had appeared, an angel in a tattered coat, no older than 8, offering salvation in the form of kindness he had never encountered before. When Marcus opened his eyes, the flower vendor was watching him again, her expression curious but not alarmed. The rain continued to fall between them, but the distance no longer seemed insurmountable. In her weathered face, he could see traces of the child who had saved his life with nothing more than generosity and courage. The recognition was impossible, improbable, yet absolutely certain. Sophie. The name emerged from memory like a prayer answered after decades of silence. The little girl who had given him her only blanket on the coldest night of his life. The angel who had disappeared before he could thank her, leaving him with a debt he had never been able to repay and a story his family had dismissed as hypothermia-induced delirium. But she hadn't been a delusion. She was real, standing across the street from his corporate tower, selling flowers in the rain, while he commanded boardrooms and accumulated wealth beyond imagination. The girl who had saved his life had grown into a woman struggling to survive in the very city where he reigned as a titan of industry. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat, emotion threatening to overwhelm the composure he had cultivated through decades of high-stakes negotiations and corporate warfare. The irony was staggering. He had spent years wondering what had become of his mysterious savior, occasionally hiring private investigators to search for traces of a homeless child named Sophie in Chicago's vast social services system. All those searches had failed, leading him to assume she had vanished into the anonymity that claimed so many vulnerable children. Yet here she was, no more than 100 yards away, as real and immediate as the rain soaking through his expensive clothes. The passage of time had transformed them both, him into a symbol of American corporate success, her into a street vendor fighting for survival, but the fundamental connection remained unchanged. She had saved his life when she had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Now he possessed the resources to change her world, if she would let him. The memory of that Chicago winter night played out in Marcus's mind with cinematic clarity. December 15th, 1994. and 94 a date burned into his consciousness, not through any calendar notation, but through the traumatic intensity of nearly dying and being reborn through a stranger's kindness. He had been 12 years old, a student at Ashford Preparatory Academy, one of the most exclusive boarding schools in the Midwest. The institution catered to the children of America's elite, grooming future leaders, with the assumption that privilege would inevitably translate into responsibility and success. Marcus's father, Richard Henley, had built Henley Enterprises from a modest construction company into a diversified empire encompassing real estate, manufacturing, and financial services. The elder Henley believed in discipline, achievement, and the unforgiving pursuit of excellence values he expected his only son to embrace without question or complaint. Ashford Prep was chosen not for its nurturing environment, but for its rigorous academic standards and its history of producing graduates who continued their families' legacies of wealth and influence. But 12-year-old Marcus had possessed the rebellious spirit common to intelligent children trapped in environments that prioritized conformity over creativity. His grades were exemplary, his test scores remarkable, yet he chafed against the structured routine that left no room for spontaneity or genuine human connection. The other students, products of similar privileged backgrounds, competed ruthlessly for academic and social dominance. Friendships were strategic alliances rather than emotional bonds, and vulnerability was seen as weakness to be exploited rather than humanity to be supported. The argument that changed everything had erupted during a mandatory weekend phone call with his father. Richard Henley had just returned from a business trip to Japan, where he had finalized a manufacturing contract that would increase the company's overseas presence significantly. Instead of sharing pride in his son's recent academic achievements, he launched into a critique of Marcus's apparent lack of ambition and leadership potential. "Your housemaster tells me you've been spending too much time reading novels instead of focusing on mathematics and economics." Richard's voice had carried its characteristic edge of disappointment. "At your age, I was already learning the fundamentals of business operations. You seem more interested in fantasy than reality." Marcus had tried to explain his fascination with literature, his belief that understanding human nature was as important as understanding market forces, but his father dismissed these interests as frivolous distractions. The conversation escalated when Richard announced that Marcus would be spending Christmas break at the corporate headquarters instead of the family estate, learning about quarterly projections and strategic planning. "I won't do it," Marcus had declared with the absolute certainty that only a 12-year-old could muster. "I hate the business, I hate the school, and I hate being told what to think and feel every minute of every day." The response had been swift and merciless. Richard had informed his son that if he couldn't appreciate the opportunities provided by his family's success, perhaps he should experience life without those advantages. The call ended with Richard instructing the school to restrict Marcus's privileges until he demonstrated a more appropriate attitude toward his responsibilities. Fury and wounded pride had driven Marcus to a decision that seemed logical in the moment, but nearly proved fatal. If his father wanted him to understand life without privilege, he would show himself capable of independence. That same evening, while his classmates attended a mandatory study session, Marcus had climbed through a window in the dormitory basement and vanished into the Chicago winter. He had planned to reach the city center, find a way to contact his mother, and prove that he could survive on his own terms. What he hadn't anticipated was the severity of the storm that engulfed the city that night, or his complete ignorance of basic survival skills that privilege had never required him to develop. Within 2 hours of leaving Ashford Prep, Marcus was hopelessly lost in a maze of unfamiliar streets, his expensive winter coat proving inadequate against the wind-driven snow that seemed to penetrate every layer of his clothing. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and the storm had intensified to the point where visibility was measured in feet rather than blocks. Street signs became illegible through the snow, and the few people he encountered hurried past without acknowledging his presence. By midnight, hypothermia had begun affecting his judgment and coordination. Marcus found himself stumbling through an alley, behind what appeared to be a closed diner, his feet numb inside his designer boots, his hands too cold to operate the cell phone he carried for emergencies. The device, a luxury that few 12-year-olds possessed in 1994, had proven useless in the storm either, due to poor signal coverage or his inability to dial with frozen fingers. Exhaustion and cold had finally forced him to collapse against a dumpster, his body shivering uncontrollably as consciousness began to fade. In his delirious state, Marcus had genuinely believed he was going to die in that alley, another casualty of adolescent pride and poor decision-making. The irony that someone with access to every conceivable advantage could die from something as basic as exposure wasn't lost on him, even as his mind began to shut down from the cold. It was then that Sophie had appeared, emerging from the shadows, like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to formulate. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her small frame wrapped in layers of clothing that had clearly been scavenged from various sources. A knit cap covered dark hair, and her face, though marked by the premature seriousness that characterized children forced to grow up too quickly, retained the essential innocence of childhood. "Hey," she had whispered, kneeling beside him in the snow. "Hey, you're gonna freeze if you stay here." Marcus had managed to focus on her face, struggling to form words through chattering teeth. Can't, move." Sophie had assessed the situation with the practical efficiency of someone far older than her years. Without hesitation, she had begun removing her outer layer, a threadbare blanket that served as her coat, revealing the thin sweater and worn jeans beneath. The blanket, Marcus would later realize, was likely her most valuable possession, the difference between relative comfort and genuine suffering in the brutal Chicago winter. "Here," she had said simply, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders. "This'll help." The gesture had been so unexpected, so generous, that Marcus had initially protested despite his desperate need. "You'll be cold," he had managed to say. "I know where to go," Sophie had replied with quiet confidence. "You don't. You're not from here." She had been right, of course. Everything about Marcus, from his expensive clothes, to his soft hands, to his obvious terror, marked him as someone displaced from a world of privilege into circumstances beyond his understanding. Yet Sophie hadn't questioned his presence or demanded explanations. She had simply recognized another human being in need and responded with instinctive compassion. For the next 4 hours, Sophie had stayed with him in that alley, sharing not only her blanket but also her knowledge of survival. She had produced a small bag of Crackershire dinner. Marcus would learn and insisted he eat half. When his shivering threatened to become convulsions, she had positioned herself beside him, using her body heat to help maintain his core temperature. "What's your name?" Marcus had asked, as the storm began to subside toward dawn. "Sophie," she had replied simply. "What's yours?" Marcus Henley." She had nodded solemnly, as though filing the information away for future reference. "Nice to meet you, Marcus Henley." They had talked sporadically through the night, Sophie sharing fragments of her story with the matter-of-fact tone children used to describe even traumatic experiences. Her parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, she explained, and she had aged out of a foster placement that hadn't worked out. The details were sparse, but Marcus understood that Sophie lived on the streets not by choice but by necessity, surviving through a combination of resourcefulness, luck, and the kindness of others in similar circumstances. "Aren't you scared?" Marcus had asked, as the first gray light of dawn began to penetrate the alley. Sophie had considered the question seriously before responding. "Sometimes. But being scared doesn't change anything. You just keep going." The wisdom in her words had struck Marcus with the force of revelation. Here was a child younger than himself, facing circumstances that would terrify most adults. Yet she possessed a strength and resilience that his privileged existence had never required him to develop. She had nothing, no family, no home, no security yet. She had chosen to share her only protection with a stranger. As morning arrived, Sophie had helped Marcus to his feet, supporting his still unsteady movement as circulation returned to his extremities. "There's a police station 6 blocks that way," she had said, pointing toward a street that looked identical to every other street in the neighborhood. "They'll help you get home." Marcus had tried to return her blanket, but Sophie had shaken her head firmly. "Keep it till you get somewhere warm. I'll be okay." "How can I find you again?" Marcus had asked desperately, suddenly aware that he was about to lose the person who had saved his life. "I want to help you. I want to repay you." Sophie had smiled then, the first genuine expression of happiness Marcus had seen from her. "You don't owe me anything. Just be nice to people when you can, okay?" Before Marcus could protest or explain about his family's wealth and resources, Sophie had disappeared into the maze of Chicago's streets with the silent efficiency of someone accustomed to avoiding attention. Marcus had stood in that alley for several minutes, clutching her blanket and scanning the empty sidewalks for any sign of his mysterious savior. But she was gone, vanishing as suddenly and completely as she had appeared. The rescue, when it came, had been swift and overwhelming. Richard Henley's private security team had been searching for Marcus throughout the night, coordinating with local police and utilizing resources that normal families couldn't access. When Marcus stumbled into the police station that Sophie had directed him toward, he was immediately surrounded by concerned adults asking rapid-fire questions about his disappearance and condition. Within hours, he was in a hospital being treated for mild hypothermia and dehydration, then transported back to Ashford Prep in his father's private helicopter. The reunion with Richard had been complicated relief mixed with anger, love tempered by disappointment. Marcus had tried to tell the story of Sophie's rescue, describing her generosity and courage with the passionate conviction of someone whose life had been fundamentally changed. But the adults in his world had struggled to accept the narrative he presented. A homeless 8-year-old girl saving a privileged 12-year-old boy with nothing more than kindness? The story sounded like the kind of hallucination that hypothermia could produce, a psychological defense mechanism created by a traumatized mind. Even when Marcus insisted on the blanket as proof, the adults dismissed it as something he might have found or acquired during his confused wandering through the city. "The important thing is that you're safe," his mother had said, stroking his hair as he lay in the hospital bed. "Sometimes, when we're frightened and cold, our minds create stories to help us cope. It doesn't mean the feelings weren't real, sweetheart." Marcus had stopped trying to convince them after the 4th or 5th dismissal. But privately, he had never doubted the reality of Sophie's existence or the magnitude of her gift. He had kept her blanket for years, even as he grew and changed and eventually inherited the empire his father had built. The threadbare fabric had become a talisman, a reminder of the night when a stranger's kindness had revealed the difference between having everything and having what truly mattered. Now, standing in the rain, outside Henley Tower, Marcus understood that the recognition flowing through him was absolutely genuine. The girl who had saved his life was selling flowers across the street, struggling to survive in the very city where he commanded vast resources and influence. The cosmic irony was almost too perfect to believe, yet Marcus felt it in his bones, the same certainty that had sustained him through that long, cold night in Chicago. Sophie looked up again, perhaps sensing his continued attention, and this time her expression showed a flicker of recognition as well. Her eyes widened slightly, and Marcus saw her lips form a single word that the distance and rain prevented him from hearing. But he knew what she had said, just as surely as he knew his own name. Marcus. 28 years of separation collapsed into irrelevance as two sets of eyes met across Park Avenue, carrying the weight of a debt that could never be repaid and a connection that time had only strengthened. The flower vendor who had lived in poverty while he accumulated billions was the angel who had given him his life. And now, finally, he had the opportunity to give her something in return. The rain continued to fall between them, but Marcus no longer felt the cold. December 15th, 1994. Chicago's winter had arrived with the merciless precision of a debt collector, transforming the city into a crystalline maze of ice and shadow. The temperature had plummeted to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind off Lake Michigan carried the bite of Arctic air that could steal breath from lungs and sensation from exposed skin within minutes. Snow fell in dense, swirling curtains that reduced visibility to mere yards and muffled the usual urban symphony into an eerie, whitewashed silence. In the narrow alley behind Murphy's Diner on West Madison Street, 8-year-old Sophie Chen moved through the darkness with the careful precision of someone who understood that survival depended on making no unnecessary noise. Her small frame was wrapped in layers of clothing collected over months of patient scavenging: a oversized men's sweater that hung to her knees, jeans with patches sewn by her own careful hands, and boots 2 sizes too large that she'd stuffed with newspaper to make them wearable. Over everything, she wore her most precious possession, a threadbare wool blanket that had once been navy blue but had faded to an indeterminate gray, its edges frayed but its warmth still intact. Sophie had claimed this particular alley 3 weeks earlier, after the older homeless woman who'd been sleeping here had been taken to the hospital with pneumonia. The location offered several advantages that Sophie's 8-year-old mind had catalogued with the methodical intelligence that kept her alive. The dumpster provided wind protection, the diner's exhaust vent offered minimal warmth, and the fire escape ladder could provide an escape route if the police or more dangerous adults discovered her shelter. The alley also held emotional significance that Sophie rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. Murphy's Diner had been where her parents, David and Lynn Chen, had shared their first date 7 years earlier. Her father, a second-generation Chinese-American accountant, had been too nervous to take her elegant mother to an expensive restaurant, choosing instead this modest establishment where the coffee was strong and the pie was homemade. Lynn, a first-grade teacher with infinite patience and boundless optimism, had fallen in love not just with David, but with his shy sincerity and the way he calculated tips with endearing precision. Sophie possessed only fragments of these stories, pieces of family history gleaned from overheard conversations and her mother's gentle bedtime tales before everything changed. She had been 5 when the drunk driver ran the red light at the intersection of Roosevelt and State, killing both her parents instantly and transforming her from a cherished daughter into a ward of the state. The trauma had left her with gaps in her memory, faces and voices that faded like morning mist, but certain details remained crystalline: her mother's laugh, her father's careful way of adjusting his glasses when he concentrated, the smell of jasmine tea that had always filled their small apartment on Sundays. The foster placement had lasted 18 months, a period Sophie remembered as an exercise in careful invisibility. The Hendersons were not cruel people, but they were overwhelmed by their own financial struggles and the 3 biological children who demanded their attention. Sophie learned quickly that expressing needs or emotions brought irritation rather than comfort, that survival meant making herself as small and undemanding as possible. When Mrs. Henderson became pregnant again and the state determined that the household could no longer accommodate additional children, Sophie was quietly transferred to a group home on the South Side. Group homes, Sophie discovered, operated on principles entirely different from families. Rules were posted on bulletin boards, affection was rationed according to bureaucratic schedules, and children competed for the limited attention of overworked staff members. Sophie's natural intelligence and tendency towards self-reliance initially served her well in this environment, but her age worked against her. Adoptive families wanted infants or toddlers, children young enough to be molded into their existing family structures. An 8-year-old with a traumatic history and an intensely private disposition was considered a challenging placement at best. The night Sophie left the group home, she hadn't intended permanent departure. A new resident, a teenager with a history of violence, had begun targeting younger children for theft and intimidation. When Sophie had refused to surrender the small jade bracelet her mother had given her, her only remaining physical connection to her family, the teenager had threatened escalation that Sophie's survival instincts recognized as genuinely dangerous. She had slipped out during the night shift change, carrying only the clothes she wore and the wool blanket that had been her father's, liberated from the evidence room where her parents' possessions had been stored. The bracelet remained hidden beneath her sweater, pressed against her heart like a talisman of protection and memory. Chicago's streets in December offered education in harsh mathematics. Calories consumed versus calories expended. Shelter found versus exposure endured. Trust extended versus vulnerability exploited. Sophie learned these equations through trial and error that sometimes left her weak with hunger or blue with cold, but never broken. She discovered which restaurant employees might share leftover food, which public buildings offered warmth during business hours, which adults could be trusted, and which represented danger she was too young to fully understand. The survival skills she developed were born of necessity rather than choice, adaptations that allowed a child to navigate an adult world designed to chew up and discard the vulnerable. Sophie learned to move silently, to observe carefully, to help others when possible without advertising her own needs. She discovered that kindness was often the only currency she possessed, but that it could purchase protection, information, and occasionally the cooperation necessary for survival. On the night she encountered Marcus Henley, Sophie had been living independently for 6 weeks. The harsh mathematics of street survival had begun to show their effects. Her face had grown gaunt, her clothes hung looser on her small frame, and her energy reserves were depleted to levels that would have alarmed any adult equipped to recognize the signs of malnutrition. Yet Sophie maintained the quiet dignity that had sustained her through every previous crisis, approaching each day with the methodical determination of someone far older than her 8 years. The storm that night had arrived with unusual ferocity, catching even experienced street dwellers off guard with its intensity and duration. Sophie had secured her position behind the dumpster early, using cardboard and newspapers to create additional insulation between her body and the concrete. She had eaten her daily Mila hot dog, purchased from a sympathetic vendor who occasionally sold food at cost to obviously hungry children, and settled into the mental state that allowed her to endure the long, cold hours until dawn. It was nearly midnight when she heard the stumbling footsteps in the alley, followed by the sound of someone collapsing against the opposite wall. Sophie remained motionless, years of street wisdom having taught her to assess potential threats before revealing her presence. The sounds that followed suggested someone in genuine distress rather than danger. Labored breathing, quiet moaning, the rustle of expensive fabric against concrete. After several minutes of careful listening, Sophie risked a look around the edge of the dumpster. In the dim light cast by a distant street lamp, she could see a figure huddled against the building, not an adult, but someone closer to her own size, wearing clothes that even in the darkness appeared far more expensive than anything she had ever seen on the streets. The person was shivering violently, arms wrapped around his knees in a futile attempt to conserve body heat. Sophie's initial instinct was self-preservation. Approaching strangers in alleys at midnight was exactly the kind of risk that street children learn to avoid, regardless of apparent circumstances. But as she watched, the figure's movements became more sluggish, his breathing more labored, and Sophie recognized the signs of advanced hypothermia that she had witnessed among other homeless individuals. Without intervention, this person would likely die before morning. The decision to help was made not through careful calculation but through immediate empathy. Sophie had experienced the terror of being cold and alone and helpless, had felt the universe's indifference to her suffering and survival. The knowledge that she could prevent another person from experiencing that ultimate abandonment overrode every survival instinct she had developed. Moving carefully to avoid startling him, Sophie approached the huddled figure and knelt in the snow beside him. Up close, she could see that he was indeed a child, perhaps a few years older than herself, with brown hair and features that spoke of privilege and protection she had never known. His winter coat, while expensive, was designed for fashion rather than survival in extreme conditions. His gloves were leather rather than insulated, his boots more suited to sidewalks than snow-filled alleys. "Hey," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Hey, you're gonna freeze if you stay here." The boy looked up with obvious difficulty, his movements slowed by cold and exhaustion. When their eyes met, Sophie saw not just physical distress but emotional devastation, the look of someone whose understanding of the world had been fundamentally shattered. Can't move," he managed through chattering teeth. Sophie assessed the situation with the practical efficiency that had kept her alive through 6 weeks of independent survival. This boy was clearly from a different world. His clothes alone probably cost more than she had ever possessed, but he was dying just as surely as any street child caught without adequate protection. The mathematics of survival applied equally to privilege and poverty when the temperature dropped below zero. Without hesitation, Sophie began removing her outer layered wool blanket that served as her primary protection against the brutal Chicago winter. The blanket was more than clothing. It was her father's legacy, her mother's love made tangible, her only defense against a world that had shown her nothing but indifference since her parents' death. Losing it would mean accepting a level of exposure that could prove fatal. Yet, as Sophie looked at the boy's blue-tinged lips and glazed eyes, the choice became clear. She had survived this long through determination and intelligence, and an inner strength that circumstances had forced her to develop. This boy possessed none of those resources, had never been required to develop them. Without help, he would die not from lack of character but from lack of preparation for a world that his privilege had never required him to understand. "Here," Sophie said simply, wrapping the blanket around his shoulders with the same care her mother had once used to tuck her into bed. "This'll help." The gesture seemed to shock the boy back to partial awareness. "You'll be cold," he protested weakly, though his body immediately began absorbing the warmth the blanket provided. "I know where to go," Sophie replied with quiet confidence, though the statement was only partially true. She knew techniques for survival without adequate clothing, methods for maintaining body heat through movement and positioning that street life had taught her. Whether those techniques would prove sufficient on a night this cold remained to be seen. "You're not from here," she observed, noting everything about him that marked his foreignness to this environment. His soft hands had never known manual labor. His posture spoke of confident expectations that the world would accommodate his needs, and his obvious terror at finding himself in danger revealed a lifetime of protection from genuine hardship. Marcus, though Sophie didn't yet know his name, managed a weak nod. I ran away from school, had a fight with my father." Sophie absorbed this information without judgment. She had learned that people found themselves on the streets through various routes, some voluntary and others imposed by circumstances beyond their control. This boy's arrival appeared to be the former, though Sophie understood that the distinction became irrelevant when survival was at stake. "What's your name?" she asked, settling beside him to share what body heat she could provide. "Marcus Henley," he replied, and Sophie filed the information away with the careful attention she paid to all potentially useful knowledge. "Nice to meet you, Marcus Henley," she said with the formal politeness her mother had taught her. "I'm Sophie." Over the next several hours, as the storm raged around them and the temperature continued to drop, Sophie deployed every survival technique she had learned during her weeks on the streets. She shared her meager food crackers saved from that day's meal, insisting that Marcus eat despite his protests. She positioned herself to provide windbreak and warmth, using her body as a barrier between him and the worst of the elements. Most importantly, she talked to him, keeping him conscious and responsive as hypothermia threatened to claim his awareness. Sophie told Marcus fragments of her story: her parents' death, the foster placements, her recent independence with the matter-of-fact tone children used to describe experiences that would traumatize adults. She spoke of survival strategies and street wisdom, of the small kindnesses that made harsh circumstances bearable and the quiet dignities that preserved humanity in inhumane situations. "Aren't you scared?" Marcus asked during a moment, when the wind temporarily subsided. Sophie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Fear was a constant companion in her life, a survival mechanism that kept her alert to danger, while occasionally threatening to paralyze her with its intensity. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But being scared doesn't change anything. You just keep going." The wisdom in her words was hard-earned, purchased through nights of terror and days of uncertainty that had taught her the difference between fear as a warning system and fear as a prison. She had learned to acknowledge terror without being controlled by it, to recognize danger without being immobilized by anxiety. As dawn approached, Sophie helped Marcus to his feet, supporting his still unsteady movement as circulation returned to his extremities. The storm had begun to subside, and the first gray light of morning revealed a city transformed by snow into something beautiful and alien. Sophie pointed toward a street that looked identical to every other street in the neighborhood, but which she knew contained a police station 6 blocks away. "They'll help you get home," she assured him, though the thought of Marcus's departure filled her with unexpected sadness. During their long night together, she had experienced something she hadn't felt since her parents' death: genuine human connection, the warmth of being needed and valued by another person. Marcus tried to return her blanket, but Sophie shook her head firmly. "Keep it till you get somewhere warm." "I'll be okay." The statement was more hope than certainty, but Sophie had learned to project confidence even when she felt none. "How can I find you again?" Marcus asked desperately, and Sophie heard in his voice something she recognized: the terror of losing someone who had shown unexpected kindness. "I want to help you. I want to repay you." Sophie smiled then, the first genuine expression of happiness she had felt in weeks. This boy, despite his obvious privilege and naivety, possessed something precious: the instinct to reciprocate kindness, to recognize and honor the gifts that others provided. "You don't owe me anything," she told him honestly. "Just be nice to people when you can, okay?" Before Marcus could protest or explain about his family's wealth and resources, Sophie had melted back into the maze of Chicago streets with the practiced invisibility that had kept her safe for weeks. She moved quickly through alleys and side streets, putting distance between herself and the alley where she had revealed her location to a stranger. The survival instincts that had temporarily yielded to compassion reasserted themselves, demanding that she prioritize her own safety now that the immediate crisis had passed. Sophie found temporary shelter in a different neighborhood, huddling in the doorway of a closed laundromat, while her body shivered uncontrollably from the cold she had accepted by giving away her blanket. The next few hours would be crucial. She needed to find replacement warmth before her core temperature dropped to dangerous levels. The mathematics of survival had shifted dramatically in Marcus's favor and against hers, but Sophie felt no regret for the choice she had made. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus stumbled into the police station that Sophie had directed him toward, immediately surrounded by concerned adults who contacted his father's private security team with urgent efficiency. Richard Henley's resources, formidable even by the standards of Chicago's elite, had been searching for Marcus throughout the night. By the time Sophie was securing new shelter, Marcus was already in an ambulance heading toward Northwestern Memorial Hospital, wrapped in heated blankets and receiving treatment for mild hypothermia. The reunion between Marcus and his father was complicated by relief, anger, and the profound fear that Richard Henley rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Standing beside his son's hospital bed, watching IV fluids restore the boy's circulation, Richard experienced the vertigo that accompanied the realization of how close he had come to losing the most important thing in his life. "I'm sorry, Dad," Marcus whispered, his voice still weak from his ordeal. "I was angry, and I did something stupid." "We'll discuss your choices later," Richard replied, though his tone carried more love than censure. "Right now, I just need you to be safe." It was then that Marcus began telling the story of Sophie's rescue, describing her generosity and courage with the passionate conviction of someone whose life had been fundamentally altered. He spoke of her sharing food when she clearly had little, of her giving him her only protection against the cold, of her staying awake all night to ensure his survival. Richard listened with the careful attention he brought to important business negotiations, but as Marcus's story progressed, concern began to replace relief. The tale his son told a homeless 8-year-old girl possessing wisdom beyond her years, sacrificing her own safety to save a stranger, sounded like the kind of narrative a traumatized mind might construct to make sense of incomprehensible circumstances. "Son," Richard said gently, "hypothermia can affect memory and perception. Sometimes our minds create stories to help us process frightening experiences." Marcus's protests were immediate and vehement. "She was real, Dad. Her name was Sophie, and she saved my life. She gave me this blanket." He clutched the threadbare wool that nurses had been reluctant to remove, treating it as evidence of his story's veracity. Dr. Patterson, the attending physician, approached the family with the diplomatic sensitivity that expensive medical care cultivated. It's not uncommon for hypothermia patients to experience some confusion about events preceding their rescue, she explained. The mind can create very vivid memories that feel absolutely real but may not correspond to actual events. Even when Marcus's mother, Elizabeth, arrived from New York, her son's insistence on Sophie's reality was met with gentle skepticism. Elizabeth possessed the emotional intelligence that her husband sometimes lacked, but she also understood the psychological trauma that Marcus had endured. The story he told was so improbable, a child giving away her only protection to save a stranger, that it seemed more like wishful thinking than factual reporting. "The important thing is that you're safe, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, stroking Marcus's hair as he lay in the hospital bed surrounded by the best medical care that money could provide. "Sometimes when we're frightened and alone, our minds create helpers to get us through the crisis. It doesn't mean the feelings weren't real." Marcus gradually stopped trying to convince the adults of Sophie's existence, but privately he never doubted the reality of what had occurred in that alley. The blanket remained his most treasured possession, a tangible reminder of the night when a stranger's kindness had revealed truths about human nature that his privileged upbringing had never taught him. The consequences of Marcus's unauthorized departure from Ashford Prep were swift and comprehensive. Within a week, arrangements had been made to transfer him to Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, an institution with even more rigorous security protocols and a philosophy that left no room for the kind of rebellion that had nearly proven fatal. The Henley family's substantial donation to Exeter ensured that Marcus would receive the individual attention necessary to prevent future incidents. But before his departure for New Hampshire, Marcus made desperate attempts to locate the girl who had saved his life. He convinced his family's driver to take him back to the alley behind Murphy's Diner, searching for any sign of Sophie's continued presence. The location looked different in daylight, smaller, more ordinary, less like the scene of a miracle and more like an unremarkable urban space where homeless individuals sometimes sought shelter. Marcus questioned employees at Murphy's Diner, describing Sophie with the precision of someone whose memory had been seared by gratitude and trauma. The waitresses and cooks listened politely but claimed no knowledge of a homeless 8-year-old girl in the neighborhood. Their responses might have reflected genuine ignorance or the protective instinct that service workers develop toward vulnerable individuals who depended on invisibility for survival. Private investigators hired by Richard Henley conducted more systematic searches, combing through social services records and interviewing personnel at group homes and foster facilities. But Chicago's bureaucracy proved remarkably opaque when it came to tracking individual children, particularly those who had slipped through official systems. Sophie Chen existed in their records as a former ward of the state who had disappeared from her last placement, but her current whereabouts remained unknown. The searches continued for months, extending even after Marcus had been enrolled at Exeter and begun the process of academic rehabilitation. Richard Henley, despite his skepticism about his son's story, authorized significant resources for the investigation. Whether motivated by genuine concern for a potentially vulnerable child or by paternal desire to ease his son's obvious distress, he pursued every available avenue for locating Sophie. But Chicago was a vast city with thousands of homeless individuals, many of them children who had learned to avoid official attention as a matter of survival. Sophie had vanished into that invisible population as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only Marcus's vivid memories and a threadbare blanket that became his most cherished possession. At Exeter Academy, Marcus channeled his frustration into academic achievement and careful planning for a future that would provide him with the resources to conduct more comprehensive searches. He excelled in his studies, while privately nurturing the hope that someday he would possess the wealth and influence necessary to find Sophie and repay the debt he carried like a sacred obligation. Teachers at Exeter noted Marcus's unusual maturity and his tendency to approach problems with methodical precision that seemed beyond his years. What they didn't understand was that his night in the Chicago alley had taught him lessons about human nature, survival, and the true meaning of generosity that no classroom could provide. Sophie's gift had been more than physical warmth. It had been a revelation about the difference between having everything and having what truly mattered. As months passed and the searches continued to yield no results, Marcus began to understand that finding Sophie might require patience measured in years or even decades. But he never doubted that someday, somehow, he would encounter her again. The universe had brought them together once in circumstances that seemed impossibly unlikely. Surely it would provide another opportunity for him to express the gratitude that had been growing in his heart since that snowy December night. The blanket Sophie had given him traveled with Marcus from Exeter to Harvard, from Harvard to the London School of Economics, and eventually to the corporate headquarters where he built his empire. It remained folded in the top drawer of his desk, a reminder of the night when an 8-year-old girl had demonstrated courage and kindness that most adults never managed to achieve. Years later, when Marcus had accumulated wealth beyond imagination and influence that spanned continents, he would still occasionally hire investigators to search for traces of Sophie Chen in Chicago's social services records. But the searches never yielded results, and gradually, Marcus accepted that his angel had vanished into the anonymity that claimed so many vulnerable children in America's cities. Yet he never stopped hoping that someday he would see her again, never stopped carrying the debt that had shaped every decision he made about wealth, responsibility, and the obligations that privilege imposed. The girl who had given him her only protection when she had nothing else to offer had planted seeds that grew into a philosophy of corporate responsibility and personal purpose that guided his entire adult life. Marcus couldn't have known that Sophie had survived the brutal weeks following their encounter, had found new sources of warmth and shelter, had eventually been connected with services that helped her begin the long journey toward stability and safety. He couldn't have predicted that she would grow into a woman who carried her own memories of that night as a treasured reminder of her capacity for goodness, even in her darkest circumstances. The threads of their lives had separated that snowy morning in 1994, pursuing trajectories that took them to opposite ends of the socio-economic spectrum. But the connection forged in that alley had never truly broken, waiting patiently for the moment when fate would bring them together again in a different city, under different circumstances, yet with the same fundamental recognition of shared humanity that had saved Marcus's life and revealed Sophie's extraordinary heart. The autumn of 1995 arrived at Exeter Academy, with the ritualistic precision that characterized New England's most prestigious educational institutions. Golden leaves scattered across manicured lawns where the sons and daughters of America's elite prepared for futures that had been mapped out before their birth. Marcus Henley, now 13, walked through the wrought iron gates, carrying more than textbooks in his leather satchel. Folded carefully beneath his advanced calculus notebook lay Sophie's threadbare blanket, a tangible reminder of the night that had fundamentally altered his understanding of human nature and moral obligation. Exeter's imposing brick buildings and ivy-covered walls represented more than architectural grandeur. They embodied a promise of intellectual rigor and social advancement that families like the Henleys had relied upon for generations. Richard Henley had graduated from these same halls 30 years earlier, as had his father before him. The Henley name appeared on bronze plaques throughout the campus, marking donations that had funded libraries, laboratories, and scholarship programs designed to cultivate the next generation of American leadership. For Marcus, however, Exeter felt less like destiny than like careful reconstruction. His parents had chosen this institution not merely for its academic excellence, but for its ability to contain and redirect the rebellious energy that had nearly proven fatal in Chicago. The school's structured environment, its comprehensive supervision protocols, and its philosophy of channeling adolescent passion into productive achievement seemed perfectly designed to prevent another midnight escape into urban darkness. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, Marcus's faculty advisor, noted his unusual intensity during their first meeting. "Your entrance examinations were exceptional," she observed, reviewing his file with professional interest. "But your teachers report a maturity that seems advanced for your age. Have you experienced circumstances that required early responsibility? Marcus had learned to deflect such inquiries with practiced diplomacy. I've had some experiences that help me understand what's really important, he replied carefully, his fingers unconsciously moving toward the satchel where Sophie's blanket rested. I want to use my education to make a meaningful difference. The academic curriculum at Exeter challenged even the most gifted students, but Marcus approached his studies with methodical determination that impressed faculty members accustomed to brilliant but undisciplined minds. He excelled in mathematics and economics, subjects that seemed to offer concrete tools for addressing the kinds of problems he had witnessed in Chicago. Yet he also pursued literature and philosophy, seeking to understand the human motivations that drove both cruelty and compassion. During his junior year, Marcus wrote a paper for his American Social Policy class titled The Economics of Homelessness: Hidden Costs of Societal Indifference. The research required him to interview social workers, analyze municipal budgets, and examine the systemic failures that left vulnerable individuals without adequate support. His professor, Dr. Robert Chenow, relation to Sophie, though Marcus always wondered, praised the work for its unusual combination of statistical rigor and emotional intelligence. Most students write about homelessness as an abstract policy challenge, Dr. Lash Bayon Chen commented during their private conference. Your analysis suggests personal familiarity with the subject. Have you volunteered with homeless services? Marcus hesitated, then chose partial honesty. I once met someone who changed my perspective on what it means to have nothing but still choose generosity. It made me want to understand how society allows such conditions to persist. The paper earned Marcus recognition beyond Exeter's campus, eventually being published in a prestigious undergraduate journal that brought him to the attention of Harvard's undergraduate admissions committee. By his senior year, Marcus had accumulated the kind of academic achievements and extracurricular leadership positions that made Ivy League acceptance virtually inevitable. Yet, even as acceptances arrived from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, he carried Sophie's blanket with him, a reminder that his privileged trajectory had been made possible by a homeless child's sacrifice. Meanwhile, 300 miles away in Chicago, Sophie Chen was navigating transitions that carried no such institutional support or familial expectations. At 16, she had aged out of the group home system, with little more than the clothes on her back, and a social worker's well-intentioned but ultimately hollow promises about available resources for young adults transitioning to independence. The apartment that Sophie found through a nonprofit housing program was a studio in a building that had seen better decades, located in a neighborhood where gunshots provided unwelcome punctuation to the urban symphony. The rent consumed 80% of her income from a job at a discount grocery store, leaving barely enough for food and utilities. Yet after years of institutional living and street survival, having her own space, however modest, felt like a miraculous luxury. Sophie's shifts at Morrison's discount grocery began at 5 in the morning and ended at 2 in the afternoon, allowing her to attend evening classes at Harold Washington College, where she had enrolled in a general education program with dreams of eventually transferring to a 4-year university. The commute between work, school, and home consumed nearly 4 hours daily, traversed through a combination of buses and walking that left her exhausted but determined. The mathematics of Sophie's survival were precise and unforgiving. After rent, transportation, and textbooks, she had approximately $60 per week for food and all other necessities. Meals often consisted of ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever damaged goods her supervisor at Morrison's allowed employees to take home. Sophie learned to ignore hunger pangs that interfered with concentration, to study by streetlight when the electricity was shut off for non-payment, and to maintain perfect attendance at both work and school despite chronic exhaustion. Her professors at Harold Washington noted Sophie's exceptional academic performance despite obvious financial struggles. Dr. Patricia Williams, who taught Introduction to Psychology, observed Sophie's ability to connect theoretical concepts with real-world observations in ways that suggested unusual life experience. Your essay on stress adaptation in adolescence demonstrates remarkable insight, Dr. Williams commented after class one evening. Have you considered psychology as a potential major? Your perspective could contribute significantly to the field. Sophie felt a familiar mixture of hope and pragmatism. I'd love to pursue psychology, she admitted, but I need to focus on programs that lead to immediate employment. I can't afford extended education without guaranteed income. The conversation represented a pattern that would characterize Sophie's educational journey: extraordinary academic potential, constrained by economic reality. While her classmates debated graduate school options and internship opportunities, Sophie calculated whether she could afford textbooks for the next semester and whether her ancient car would survive another Chicago winter. At Harvard University, Marcus immersed himself in an environment where intellectual achievement was assumed rather than exceptional. Surrounded by the sons and daughters of presidents, CEOs, and Nobel laureates, he initially struggled with imposter syndrome despite his academic preparation. The casual references to family foundations, summer homes in Martha's Vineyard, and spring breaks in European capitals reminded him daily of the rarefied world he inhabited. Yet Marcus found purpose in courses that examined economic inequality and social policy. Professor Elena Vasquez's seminar on wealth distribution and social mobility became his intellectual home, a space where he could explore the systemic forces that created and perpetuated the conditions he had witnessed in Chicago. His senior thesis, Corporate Responsibility in Post-Industrial America, argued for business models that prioritized social impact alongside profit maximization. Your analysis is sophisticated, Professor Vasquez noted during their final conference, but it's also passionate in ways that suggest personal investment. Most students write about corporate responsibility as theoretical exercise. You write as though you've experienced the consequences of corporate indifference firsthand. Marcus smiled carefully. I believe business leaders have obligations that extend beyond shareholder returns. Companies that ignore their broader social impact are ultimately undermining the communities that sustain them. The thesis caught the attention of Harvard Business School's admissions committee, though Marcus had already decided to pursue his MBA elsewhere. The London School of Economics offered a perspective on international business that seemed more aligned with his vision of global corporate responsibility. More practically, 2 years in London would provide distance from his father's expectations and create space for independent development of his professional philosophy. During his time at LSE, Marcus supplemented his formal education with volunteer work at homeless shelters throughout London. Drawn by an inexplicable need to understand the circumstances that had brought Sophie to that Chicago alley. The individuals he met, former veterans, displaced immigrants, people whose lives had been upended by mental illness or economic catastrophe, helped him comprehend the complex pathways that led to homelessness. One evening at a shelter in East London, Marcus encountered a young woman named Catherine who reminded him powerfully of Sophie. Perhaps 20 years old, with the premature wariness that characterized people who had learned to expect disappointment, Catherine had aged out of the British care system and was struggling to establish independent life while battling addiction issues stemming from childhood trauma. The thing people don't understand, Catherine told him during one of their conversations, is that once you've been written off by society, it's almost impossible to write yourself back in. No matter how hard you try, how many jobs you apply for, how many times you get clean, there's always something that marks you as damaged goods. Marcus listened with the intense attention he brought to everything connected to his understanding of Sophie's experience. But you keep trying, he observed. Despite the obstacles, you keep fighting for better circumstances. Catherine shrugged with the fatalistic humor that helped her navigate daily indignities. What's the alternative? Giving up means dying, and I'm too stubborn to die yet. Her words echoed in Marcus's mind as he completed his MBA and began considering career options. Investment banking offers from London and New York promised immediate wealth and social status that would exceed even his family's expectations. But Marcus found himself drawn instead to opportunities that would allow him to test his theories about corporate responsibility and social impact. The position he ultimately accepted, junior associate at a sustainable development firm based in New York, disappointed his father, who had expected his son to join Henley Enterprises immediately upon completing his education. Richard Henley's vision of dynasty and legacy seemed to require Marcus's participation in the family business, but Marcus was determined to establish his own credentials before inheriting responsibilities he had never requested. "You're wasting your Harvard education on idealistic nonsense," Richard complained during one of their increasingly tense dinners. Sustainable development is a luxury that successful companies can afford after they've achieved market dominance. Start with real business, then indulge your humanitarian impulses. Marcus had learned to respond to his father's criticisms with diplomatic patience. "I want to understand how businesses can create value while addressing social problems. That knowledge will make me more effective when I eventually join Henley Enterprises." The compromise satisfied neither father nor son completely, but it provided Marcus with space to develop the professional philosophy that would eventually revolutionize his approach to corporate leadership. Working with communities in developing countries, implementing microfinance programs, and sustainable agriculture initiatives, Marcus witnessed firsthand the transformative potential of businesses that prioritized social impact alongside financial returns. While Marcus was building theoretical frameworks for corporate responsibility, Sophie was learning harsh lessons about economic vulnerability through lived experience. At 22, she had managed to complete her associate degree from Harold Washington College while maintaining full-time employment, an achievement that should have opened doors to better opportunities. Instead, she discovered that a 2-year degree from a community college carried little weight in Chicago's competitive job market. The promotion she had been promised at Morrison's grocery assistant manager with a modest salary increase was given instead to the nephew of a store owner, despite Sophie's superior performance and longer tenure. The disappointment was crushing not merely because of the lost income, but because it represented another confirmation that merit alone was insufficient to overcome systemic disadvantages. Sophie found new employment at a medical billing company, where her attention to detail and mathematical aptitude made her valuable despite her limited formal credentials. The work was tedious but stable, and the health insurance benefits represented a luxury she had never previously enjoyed. For 18 months, Sophie allowed herself to believe that she had achieved a measure of security that might permit her to pursue bachelor's degree completion. The tuition payment plan she had negotiated with Roosevelt University was manageable if she maintained her current income and avoided any major expenses. Sophie enrolled in evening classes, pursuing a degree in social work that seemed aligned with her desire to help others navigate systems that had nearly defeated her. Her professors recognized her exceptional insight into the challenges facing vulnerable populations, and several encouraged her to consider graduate study in clinical psychology or social policy. But economic security proved fragile for someone without family resources or professional networks to provide emergency support. When Sophie's ancient Honda finally succumbed to mechanical failure beyond her ability to repair, the choice between car payments and tuition became stark and immediate. Without reliable transportation, her commute to the medical billing company became impossible, and Chicago's public transportation system was inadequate for reaching the suburban office where she worked. The job loss forced Sophie to withdraw from Roosevelt University just one semester before completing her bachelor's degree. The timing was particularly cruel because she had been accepted into an internship program with the Chicago Department of Family Services that would have provided both practical experience and potential permanent employment. Without the degree completion, the internship was no longer available. Sophie found new work closer to public transportation lines, but the positions available to someone with incomplete higher education paid significantly less than her previous job. A series of temporary administrative positions provided inconsistent income that made long-term planning impossible. Rent payments became sporadic, utility disconnections became routine, and Sophie once again found herself calculating the mathematics of survival with resources that never quite covered basic needs. During this period of financial instability, Sophie volunteered at a homeless shelter on weekends, drawn by recognition that her own circumstances were only marginally more secure than those of the individuals seeking services. Working with children who reminded her of her 8-year-old self, Sophie discovered a sense of purpose that transcended her personal struggles. Maria Santos, the shelter director, observed Sophie's natural ability to connect with clients who often mistrusted authority figures. "You have unusual insight into the mindset of people who've been let down by systems," Maria noted. "Have you considered pursuing certification in social work? We could help you find funding for education completion." Sophie felt the familiar tension between aspiration and pragmatism. "I'd love to finish my degree," she admitted, "but I can't afford to reduce my work hours for classes. Every month is a struggle to make rent." The conversation highlighted the catch-22 that trapped many individuals in cycles of poverty. The education necessary for economic advancement required resources that survival-level employment couldn't provide, while the lack of advanced education ensured continued entrapment in low-wage work. By 2006, Marcus had established himself as a rising star in sustainable development, having successfully managed projects in Guatemala, Kenya, and Bangladesh that demonstrated the viability of businesses designed to address social problems while generating sustainable profits. His reputation for combining financial acumen with cultural sensitivity made him sought after by nonprofit organizations and for-profit companies seeking to expand into emerging markets. The success of his development work had also begun attracting attention from Henley Enterprises board members, who recognized that Marcus's expertise in emerging markets could prove valuable for the company's planned international expansion. Richard Henley, initially skeptical of his son's unconventional career path, had gradually come to appreciate the strategic value of Marcus's knowledge and relationships. "Your work in microfinance has created opportunities that traditional investment approaches couldn't access," Richard acknowledged during one of their quarterly dinners. "Perhaps it's time to discuss your transition to Henley Enterprises. We could establish a division focused on sustainable development, with you as its director." The offer represented everything Marcus had theoretically wanted: the opportunity to implement his vision of corporate responsibility within a company that possessed the resources to create meaningful impact. Yet he found himself hesitating, uncertain whether his idealism could survive within the institutional pressures that shaped family businesses. During this period of professional reflection, Marcus often thought about Sophie, wondering whether his success in helping strangers around the world was somehow compensating for his inability to help the girl who had saved his life. He kept her blanket in his apartment, a reminder of the debt that no professional achievement could fully repay. The opportunity that finally convinced Marcus to join Henley Enterprises emerged from an unexpected source. The company's insurance carrier had identified climate change as a significant long-term risk to their real estate and manufacturing investments. Rather than simply adjusting coverage terms, the board decided to explore proactive strategies for reducing environmental vulnerabilities while creating new revenue streams. "We need someone who understands both environmental policy and international markets," Richard explained during the formal job offer meeting. "Your experience with sustainable development makes you uniquely qualified to lead our climate adaptation initiatives." Marcus accepted the position, with the understanding that he would have unprecedented autonomy to develop programs that aligned environmental protection with economic growth. His first major initiative, renewable energy subsidiary that would reduce operating costs while generating carbon credits for SAL, demonstrated the financial viability of sustainable business practices. Within 2 years, Marcus had been promoted to Senior Vice President for Strategic Development, with responsibility for identifying acquisition targets and expansion opportunities that aligned with Henley Enterprises' evolving mission. His success had vindicated his unconventional career path while positioning him as his father's likely successor. Yet even as Marcus accumulated wealth and influence that exceeded his childhood expectations, he continued searching for traces of Sophie in Chicago's social services records. Private investigators hired discreetly through his personal attorney had combed through databases and interviewed former group home workers, but Sophie Chen seemed to have vanished as completely as she had that snowy morning in 1994. Meanwhile, Sophie's life had been upended by forces beyond her control or prediction. The economic crisis that began in 2007 and accelerated through 2008 created unemployment levels not seen since the Great Depression, hitting hardest at the kind of temporary and entry-level positions that had sustained Sophie's fragile economic stability. The medical billing company where Sophie had found steady work collapsed when their major client, a chain of urgent care clinics, declared bankruptcy. Unemployment benefits provided temporary relief, but the job market had contracted so severely that competition for minimum wage positions became fierce. Sophie found herself competing against former managers and college graduates for jobs stocking shelves and cleaning offices. The apartment she had managed to keep for 3 years was lost when her savings were exhausted and new employment proved impossible to secure. Sophie's choices narrowed to sleeping in her car or returning to the homeless shelter system she had escaped a decade earlier. Pride and practical considerations made the shelter seem preferable, at least temporarily. Lincoln Park Community Shelter had improved significantly since Sophie's childhood, offering not just basic housing but also job placement services and educational support programs. Sophie qualified for a private room rather than dormitory-style accommodation, and the caseworkers treated residents with dignity rather than suspicion. But the psychological impact of returning to institutional housing was devastating for someone who had struggled so hard to achieve independence. Sophie found herself surrounded by other victims of economic forces beyond their control: former homeowners who had lost houses to foreclosure, college graduates who couldn't find entry-level positions, families that had been middle class until medical emergencies or job losses destroyed their financial stability. "The thing about being homeless during a recession," explained Janet Morrison, Sophie's roommate at the shelter, "is that you're not just competing with other poor people for resources. You're competing with formerly successful people who have better credentials and more professional experience." Janet had been a real estate agent before the housing market collapsed, earning enough to support her 2 children and elderly mother. When commissions disappeared and savings were exhausted, she found herself navigating social services for the first time in her life. "I used to drive past homeless people and think they just needed to try harder," Janet admitted with bitter humor. "Now I understand that sometimes trying harder isn't enough when the entire system is broken." Sophie's experience at Lincoln Park Shelter was complicated by her recognition that many newer residents possessed advantages she had never enjoyed: family connections, professional networks, educational credentials from prestigious institutions. Yet they had been defeated by economic forces in ways that made Sophie's lifelong poverty seem almost enviable by comparison. The shelter's job placement program eventually connected Sophie with part-time work at several locations: housekeeping at a hotel downtown, food service at a university cafeteria, and weekend shifts at a florist shop in Lincoln Park. The combination of jobs provided enough income to qualify for subsidized housing, though the 40-hour weekly schedule across 3 locations left Sophie exhausted and without time for educational advancement. The florist position became Sophie's favorite despite its lowest hourly wage, partly because the work reminded her of her mother's love for gardening, but mainly because of Eleanor Hartwell, the elderly woman who owned Hartwell Flowers. Eleanor had operated the shop for 40 years, serving Lincoln Park's affluent residents with arrangements for weddings, funerals, and social events that marked the milestones of comfortable lives. "You have natural ability with flowers," Eleanor observed after Sophie had been working weekends for several months. "Have you considered learning floral design professionally? There are certification programs that could lead to better employment." Sophie felt the familiar conflict between aspiration and pragmatism. "I'd love to learn more," she admitted, "but I can't afford to reduce my current work hours for training programs." Eleanor was quiet for several minutes, arranging roses with the practiced efficiency of decades of experience. "What if we made an arrangement?" she finally proposed. "I could train you during slow periods, and you could gradually take on more responsibility. Eventually, if things work out, we might discuss partnership or ownership transition." The opportunity represented everything Sophie had learned to distrust. Promises that seemed too generous, offers that might disappear when circumstances changed, hope that could lead to devastating disappointment. Yet Eleanor's proposal also resonated with Sophie's deep need to find meaningful work that utilized her intelligence and creativity. For 2 years, Sophie developed skills in floral design while maintaining her other jobs, gradually taking on more responsibilities at Heartfelt Flowers as Eleanor began scaling back her involvement. The informal apprenticeship provided Sophie with knowledge that extended beyond technical skills, understanding seasonal flower markets, managing supplier relationships, creating custom arrangements that reflected clients' personalities and occasions. Eleanor's death from a sudden stroke in early 2011 was devastating both personally and professionally for Sophie. The elderly woman had become a surrogate grandmother, providing emotional support and practical guidance that Sophie had never experienced from family members. Eleanor's will revealed her intention to bequeath the flower shop to Sophie, but legal complications with distant relatives and outstanding business debts made the transition impossible. The shop was eventually sold to pay Eleanor's estate obligations, leaving Sophie unemployed and grieving the loss of both mentor and opportunity. The new owners retained Sophie temporarily to ensure customer service continuity, but their long-term plans involved automated ordering systems that would eliminate most positions. Sophie's remaining jobs, housekeeping and food service, provided insufficient income for maintaining her subsidized apartment, forcing another transition to temporary housing that consumed energy and hope in equal measure. The cycle of near stability, followed by renewed crisis, had become the dominant pattern of Sophie's adult life, each setback erasing progress that had required months or years to achieve. By 2012, Sophie had accumulated enough experience and references to secure full-time employment as a hotel housekeeper, work that was physically demanding but offered health insurance and predictable scheduling. The job allowed her to rent a small studio apartment, and for several months, Sophie began to believe that she had finally achieved sustainable independence. But the hotel where she worked was sold to a hospitality corporation that immediately implemented efficiency measures designed to reduce labor costs. Sophie's position was eliminated, along with 30% of the housekeeping staff, replaced by automated systems and reduced service standards that the new management believed clients would accept in exchange for lower room rates. The unemployment that followed coincided with changes in federal assistance programs that reduced both the duration and amount of benefits available to displaced workers. Sophie found herself facing choices that had become grimly familiar: accept employment that paid less than her basic living expenses, or risk homelessness while searching for sustainable work. The flower cart that became Sophie's means of survival was purchased used from a vendor who was retiring, financed through a microloan program designed to help low-income individuals start small businesses. The work was seasonal and weather-dependent, requiring Sophie to purchase flowers each morning from wholesale markets and sell them throughout the day to pedestrians who might be motivated by impulse or compassion. The mathematics of flower vending were harsh even by the standards of Sophie's previous employment. Good locations required permits that were expensive and difficult to obtain, while available spots often generated insufficient traffic to justify the time investment. Weather conditions that were uncomfortable for customers could eliminate entire days of potential income. Yet the work also offered something that Sophie's previous jobs had lacked: autonomy and direct connection with people who might appreciate beauty despite the urban environment's general indifference to human needs. Sophie learned to read pedestrians quickly, identifying those who might be moved by the sight of fresh flowers and those who would pass without acknowledgement. Regular customers began to develop, mostly workers from nearby office buildings who appreciated Sophie's quiet dignity and careful attention to flower quality. Dr. Chen from the medical building bought daisies every Friday for his reception desk, insisting that they brightened the atmosphere for anxious patients. Mrs. Rodriguez purchased carnations each Sunday after church, explaining that flowers honored her deceased husband's memory. These small relationships provided Sophie with purpose that transcended mere survival, reminding her that even in reduced circumstances, she could contribute to others' happiness in modest but meaningful ways. The work also allowed her to maintain the hope that circumstances might eventually improve, that some combination of persistence and opportunity might create pathways to stability she had been seeking throughout her adult life. As 2013 progressed toward winter, Sophie had established a routine that provided basic sustenance, if not prosperity. The flower cart generated enough income to maintain a small apartment and purchase necessities, though savings remained impossible and any unexpected expense could trigger financial crisis. Standing in the November rain outside office buildings in Manhattan, Sophie often thought about the path that had brought her from Eleanor's flower shop to street vending, from childhood dreams of psychology education to the daily mathematics of survival. The journey had required resilience that she sometimes doubted she possessed, yet each morning she arranged her flowers with care that honored their beauty regardless of their commercial prospects. Sophie couldn't have known that across the country, Marcus Henley was preparing to assume control of his family's business empire, having spent decades developing corporate responsibility initiatives that were directly inspired by the kindness she had shown him as a child. The threads of their lives had diverged dramatically, yet the connection forged in that Chicago alley continued to influence decisions that would eventually bring them together again. The girl who had given away her only protection to save a stranger had grown into a woman whose quiet dignity survived circumstances that would have broken many people. The boy whose life she had saved had become a man whose success was measured not only in accumulated wealth, but in his commitment to helping others achieve opportunities he had been privileged to receive. Their reunion waited just beyond the horizon, delayed but not destroyed by the different paths they had traveled through lives shaped by circumstances beyond their control. The November rain had intensified during Marcus's moment of frozen recognition, transforming Park Avenue into a river of reflected neon and rushing water. Steam rose from manholes and heated concrete, creating an ethereal mist that seemed to blur the boundaries between past and present. Marcus stood transfixed beneath the granite overhang of Henley Tower, his expensive Italian suit soaked through, his carefully maintained schedule completely forgotten as he stared at the slight figure arranging flowers across the busy street. 28 years collapsed into insignificance as Marcus watched Sophie work with the same methodical care he remembered from that December night in Chicago. Her movements possessed an economy of motion, born from years of making every gesture count, every moment of warmth precious. She adjusted each stem with attention that elevated the simple act of flower arranging into something approaching reverence, treating wilted daisies and rain-battered roses as though they possessed inherent dignity regardless of their commercial prospects. Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone to cancel the Meridian Capital meeting, his voice barely steady as he spoke to his assistant. "Jennifer, I need to postpone everything for the rest of the afternoon. Something urgent has come up." He ended the call before she could ask questions, knowing that no explanation he could offer would make sense to anyone who hadn't lived through the experience that had fundamentally shaped his understanding of human nature and moral obligation. The distance between them, perhaps 60 yards of rain-slicked asphalt and rushing traffic, seemed simultaneously insurmountable and negligible. Marcus had crossed continents to implement development projects, had negotiated with heads of state and corporate titans, yet the prospect of approaching this fragile woman selling flowers felt more daunting than any challenge he had previously faced. What did one say to an angel who had vanished for 3 decades? How did one express gratitude for a gift so profound that it had shaped every subsequent decision, every business strategy, every moment of conscious moral choice? Marcus forced himself to move, stepping from the shelter of his corporate headquarters into the downpour that immediately penetrated his wool overcoat. The crossing light seemed to take an eternity to change, giving him too much time to doubt the wisdom of this approach. What if he was wrong? What if decades of searching and hoping had created a resemblance where none existed? What if this woman was simply another victim of economic forces beyond her control, and his recognition was nothing more than wishful thinking projected onto a stranger's face? But as Marcus drew closer, weaving through pedestrians who hurried past without acknowledging the flower vendor's presence, certainty replaced doubt. The bone structure was unmistakable despite the changes that time and hardship had wrought. Her eyes, though marked by years of struggle, retained the same depth of compassion that had saved his life when she was 8 years old. The way she held herself straight, despite obvious fatigue, dignified. Despite circumstances that would have broken, many people spoke of the same inner strength that had enabled a homeless child to share her only protection with a stranger. Sophie looked up as Marcus approached, her initial expression showing the careful neutrality that street vendors developed when dealing with potential customers. Her professional smile faltered slightly as she registered his intensity. The way his gaze seemed to search her face for confirmation of something she couldn't immediately identify. There was nothing threatening in his demeanor, but his focus was unusual, more personal than commercial, more emotional than transactional. "Beautiful flowers," Marcus managed, his voice rougher than intended. Up close, he could see the premature lines around Sophie's eyes. The way her thin jacket failed to provide adequate protection against the November cold, the careful patch on her left sleeve that spoke of making do with limited resources. Yet she radiated a quiet dignity that made her circumstances seem irrelevant, a presence that transformed the simple act of flower vending into something approaching art. "Thank you," Sophie replied with genuine warmth, gesturing toward her modest display. "The roses are from this morning's market still, fresh despite the rain. The daisies might look a bit sad, but they'll perk up once they're in water and warmth." Her voice carried the same melodic quality Marcus remembered, though now tempered with the careful precision of someone who had learned that words could mean the difference between making a sale and going hungry. Marcus found himself staring at her hands as she adjusted the flower arrangements, noting how her fingers moved with practiced efficiency despite their obvious exposure to cold and weather. Those same hands had wrapped her father's blanket around a freezing 12-year-old, had shared crackers that represented her only meal, had provided warmth and comfort through the longest night of his life. "Sophie," he said quietly, testing the name that had echoed in his memory for 3 decades. The effect was immediate and profound. Sophie's eyes widened with shock, her hands freezing in their careful arrangement of stems. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them as recognition dawned in her expression, not gradual realization, but instant, overwhelming understanding of who was standing before her in the rain. "Marcus?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the traffic noise and falling precipitation. "Marcus Henley?" The confirmation hit Marcus like a physical blow, releasing emotions he had carefully contained for nearly 30 years. "It's you," he said, tears mixing with rainwater on his face. "It's really you. I've been looking for you since that night. I never stopped looking." Sophie's composure, maintained through decades of hardship and disappointment, cracked visibly as the full impact of their reunion registered. The successful businessman standing before her bore little resemblance to the terrified boy she had found freezing in a Chicago alley. Yet his eyes were unmistakably the same, still capable of the vulnerability she had recognized in that 12-year-old who had nearly died from exposure and pride. "I can't believe you remember," Sophie said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "I never thought, after all these years, with everything that must have happened in your life." She gestured vaguely at his expensive clothes, the Henley Tower rising behind him, the obvious markers of success and privilege that surrounded them. Marcus felt his heart breaking at the suggestion that his gratitude might have faded with time or success. "Remember, Sophie, you saved my life. You gave me your blanket when you had nothing else. You stayed awake all night to keep me warm. How could I ever forget something like that?" The rain continued to fall around them, but neither seemed to notice the precipitation that soaked through their clothes and created small rivers along the sidewalk. Other pedestrians hurried past, focused on their own destinations and discomforts, oblivious to the extraordinary reunion taking place beside a modest flower cart. "You were so young," Sophie said, studying Marcus's face as though trying to reconcile the successful man with the frightened child from her memory. "So scared and cold, I just did what anyone would do." "No," Marcus corrected gently but firmly. "You did what someone extraordinary would do. Most people would have walked past, would have been too frightened or too focused on their own survival to help a stranger. You were 8 years old, living on the streets, and you gave away your only protection to save someone you didn't know." Sophie looked away, uncomfortable with praise that seemed to assign heroic proportions to what she remembered as a simple human response to suffering. "I had experience with being cold and scared," she said quietly. "I knew you wouldn't survive the night without help. It wasn't noble, it was just necessary." The casual way she dismissed her own courage struck Marcus as profoundly characteristic of the woman he was rediscovering. Even now, reduced to selling flowers in the rain, she maintained the same instinctive humility that had made her generosity so pure and unconditional. "What happened to you?" Marcus asked, though he immediately regretted the question's potential to cause pain. "After that night, after I was rescued, I tried to find you. My family hired investigators, searched through social services records. You just vanished." Sophie smiled with rueful understanding. "I got good at vanishing. It was a survival skill on the streets, know when to be invisible, when to move to new territory, when to avoid people who might seem helpful but could actually be dangerous." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "But honestly, I assumed you'd forgotten about me once you got back to your real life. Kids from your world don't usually maintain friendships with homeless children." Marcus felt a stab of guilt at how accurately she had assessed the skepticism his family had shown toward his story. "My parents thought I had hallucinated you," he admitted. "They said hypothermia could cause the mind to create helpful figures that didn't actually exist. But I never doubted you were real. I kept your blanket. I still have it." The revelation seemed to shock Sophie more than their initial recognition had. "You kept my father's blanket? After all these years?" "It's in my office," Marcus confirmed. "In the top drawer of my desk. I've carried it with me through college, graduate school, every job I've had. It reminds me of the night that changed everything about how I understand kindness and responsibility." Sophie was quiet for several minutes, processing the idea that her childhood gesture had resonated so profoundly with someone whose life had taken such a dramatically different trajectory. "I never imagined," she began, then stopped, apparently struggling to articulate her amazement. "Tell me about your life," Marcus said gently. "Tell me what happened after that night. I need to understand where you've been, how you survived, why you're here selling flowers instead of—" He gestured helplessly, unable to complete the sentence in any way that wouldn't sound presumptuous or insulting. Sophie's laugh carried no bitterness despite the harsh realities she was about to describe. "Instead of what? Living in a penthouse? Running a corporation? Marcus, look at where I came from. A homeless 8-year-old doesn't typically grow up to join the Manhattan elite." But as she began to describe her journey, the failed foster placements, the struggle to complete education while working multiple jobs, the cycles of near stability followed by renewed crisis, Marcus heard in her story not limitation, but extraordinary resilience. Every setback she described would have defeated most people, yet she had persevered with quiet determination that never seemed to consider surrender as an option. "After Eleanor died and I lost the flower shop opportunity, I thought about giving up," Sophie admitted, referring to the elderly woman who had offered her mentorship and potential ownership before legal complications made the transition impossible. "But then I realized that Eleanor had taught me something valuable about finding beauty in difficult circumstances, about treating every flower with respect, regardless of its commercial value." Marcus listened with growing amazement as Sophie described her current life, not just the obvious hardships of street vending and financial insecurity, but the small ways she continued to help others, despite her own limited resources. She spoke of sharing her lunch with other vendors who had been less successful that day, of directing tourists to competitors when she didn't have what they were looking for, of offering flowers at reduced prices to elderly customers on fixed incomes. "Mrs. Rodriguez comes by every Sunday after church," Sophie explained, adjusting a bouquet of carnations with careful attention. "She buys flowers for her husband's grave, but I know her Social Security barely covers her rent. So I always find a way to give her the best flowers for whatever she can afford." The casual way Sophie described this generosity, though helping others was as natural as breathing, reminded Marcus powerfully of the 8-year-old who had shared her crackers and blanket without hesitation. Success and privilege had changed his circumstances dramatically, but Sophie's essential character had remained constant despite decades of hardship. "You're still the same person," Marcus said with wonder. "Despite everything you've been through, you're still the girl who gives away what she can't afford to lose." Sophie considered this observation with the thoughtful attention she brought to most questions. "I suppose when you've had nothing, you understand that sharing what little you have doesn't make you poorer, it makes you human. The people who walk past my cart every day, they're not happier than I am just because they have more money." Marcus felt the truth of her words like a physical blow, recognizing how easily he could have become one of those people who hurried past without acknowledgement, too focused on accumulating wealth and influence to notice the dignity present in circumstances he would have considered beneath his attention. "I've built a company worth billions," Marcus said quietly, "but I've never accomplished anything as important as what you did in that alley. You saved my life, but more than that, you showed me what courage and generosity actually look like." The revelation of Marcus's financial success seemed to surprise Sophie less than his continued gratitude for her childhood kindness. "I'm glad your life turned out well," she said with genuine warmth. "I sometimes wondered what happened to that scared boy. I hoped he had found his way home safely." Marcus stared at her in amazement, recognizing that Sophie had just confirmed something he had always suspected but never dared to believe. Her act of kindness had been motivated by pure compassion rather than any expectation of reward or recognition. She had saved his life and then spent 30 years hoping he was well, without any thought that he might owe her something in return. "Sophie," he said urgently, "I want to help you. I want to repay what you did for me. You shouldn't be selling flowers in the rain when you could be." "When I could be what?" Sophie interrupted gently but firmly. "Living in a world where I don't belong? Marcus, I appreciate the sentiment, but I've learned to find dignity in honest work. I'm not asking for rescue." Her response challenged assumptions Marcus hadn't realized he was making, forcing him to confront the possibility that his desire to help might be motivated as much by his own need to resolve guilt as by genuine concern for her welfare. Yet he also recognized in her refusal the same pride that had enabled her to survive decades of hardship without losing her essential humanity. "I'm not offering rescue," Marcus clarified, though he wondered if that was entirely true. "I'm offering partnership. You saved my life when I had nothing to offer in return. Now I have resources that could create opportunities not just for you, but for other people facing the same circumstances you've navigated." Sophie studied his face with the careful attention she had learned to apply to potential customers, trying to assess his sincerity and understand his motivations. What kind of opportunities? Marcus felt excitement building as he began to articulate ideas that had been forming since the moment he recognized her. A foundation focused on helping people transition out of homelessness and poverty. Job training programs, microfinance initiatives, educational scholarships, all the resources that could have made your journey easier. You would help design the programs because you understand the challenges better than any consultant or academic. The proposition clearly intrigued Sophie, though she maintained the cautious expression of someone who had learned to distrust offers that seemed too generous. "Why would you want my help?" "You have access to experts with credentials and experience I'll never possess." "Because expertise isn't the same as wisdom," Marcus replied. "You've lived through circumstances that most experts have only studied. You know what actually works versus what sounds good in theory. Most importantly, You've maintained your compassion despite having every reason to become bitter or cynical." Sophie was quiet for several minutes, her hands continuing to arrange flowers while her mind processed the implications of Marcus's offer. Around them, the lunch rush continued with typical Manhattan urgency, but their conversation had created a bubble of intimacy that seemed to exclude the surrounding chaos. "I need to think about this," Sophie said finally. "Your offer is generous, but I've learned to be careful about accepting help that might come with expectations I can't meet." Marcus nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her caution while feeling disappointed by the delay. "Of course. But Sophie, there are no expectations beyond your willingness to help others the way you helped me. This isn't charity. It's a partnership between equals who happen to have different resources." The description of their potential relationship as a partnership between equals seemed to resonate with Sophie in ways that offers of charity had not. For the first time since their reunion began, Marcus saw genuine interest replace cautious skepticism in her expression. "I'd want to start small," Sophie said slowly. "Maybe help design programs before implementing anything major. I've seen too many well-intentioned initiatives fail because they were created by people who didn't understand the realities of the populations they were trying to serve." Marcus felt hope blooming in his chest as he recognized Sophie's willingness to engage with his proposal, even if tentatively. "Whatever pace feels comfortable to you. The important thing is that we work together to help other people avoid the struggles you've faced alone." As their conversation continued, Marcus became increasingly aware of how his overwhelming gratitude for Sophie's childhood kindness was being complicated by growing guilt over the different paths their lives had taken. While he had accumulated wealth and influence beyond imagination, she had struggled for survival in circumstances that his privilege had protected him from ever experiencing. "I should have found you sooner," Marcus said, the words carrying the weight of 30 years of frustrated searching. "I should have done more to locate you, should have used my resources more effectively. While I was building my career and accumulating wealth, you were facing hardships I can barely comprehend." Sophie's response was immediate and surprisingly firm. "Marcus, you were a 12-year-old child when we met. You couldn't have found me even if you had tried harder. I was deliberately staying invisible to protect myself. And your success doesn't diminish the value of what you've accomplished or create any obligation to feel guilty about opportunities you were lucky enough to receive." Her absolution of his guilt seemed as generous as her original gift of the blanket, yet Marcus found it difficult to accept. "But the unfairness of it, that I had every advantage while you faced every obstacle, doesn't that bother you?" Sophie considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Life isn't fair, Marcus. I learned that when my parents died. But unfairness cuts both ways. You could have been a spoiled rich kid who never learned empathy or developed any sense of social responsibility. Instead, you became someone who cares about helping others. That suggests that good things can emerge from circumstances that seem purely negative." Marcus stared at her in amazement, recognizing that Sophie was offering him a perspective on their divergent paths that transformed guilt into purpose, regret into motivation. She had not only saved his life 30 years ago, she was still teaching him lessons about human nature and moral responsibility that his expensive education had never provided. "I want to learn from you," Marcus said with sudden clarity. "Not just about designing programs to help others, but about maintaining dignity and compassion in difficult circumstances. You've accomplished something I'm not sure I could have managed. You've survived extraordinary hardship without losing your essential kindness." The afternoon light was beginning to fade as their conversation continued, the November rain gradually subsiding into a fine mist that softened the harsh edges of Manhattan's urban landscape. Sophie had sold only a few flowers during their reunion, but she seemed unconcerned about the lost income, as though reconnecting with Marcus had value that transcended commercial considerations. "I need to ask you something," Sophie said as their conversation began to wind down. "In all these years, with all your success and achievements, why did finding me matter so much? You could have simply been grateful for what happened and moved on with your life." Marcus felt the question penetrate to the core of motivations he had never fully examined. Because you changed everything about how I understand human nature and moral obligation," he said slowly. "Before that night, I thought kindness was something people could afford after they had taken care of their own needs. You showed me that real generosity comes from people who have nothing left to give but choose to share it anyway." He paused, searching for words to describe the profound impact her childhood kindness had continued to have on his adult decisions. "Every business strategy I've developed, every social responsibility initiative I've implemented, every choice I've made about how to use wealth and influence, it's all been shaped by the example you set in that alley. You didn't just save my life, you showed me how to live it." Sophie's eyes filled with tears at his explanation, as though she was hearing for the first time that her moment of childhood compassion had rippled forward through decades to influence decisions that affected thousands of people around the world. "I never imagined," she whispered, "that such a small thing could matter so much to someone's entire life." "It wasn't small," Marcus corrected gently. "It was everything. And now I want to help you create the same kind of ripple effects for other people who are facing the circumstances you've navigated with such extraordinary grace." As the afternoon faded into evening and the rain finally stopped, Marcus and Sophie stood beside her flower cart, surrounded by the detritus of another Manhattan business day. Yet their reunion had transformed the ordinary street corner into something approaching sacred space, a place where past and present had converged to create possibilities neither of them could have imagined. The girl who had given away her only protection to save a stranger had grown into a woman whose dignity transcended circumstance, whose wisdom had been earned through experiences that would have defeated most people. The boy whose life she had saved had become a man whose success was measured not only in accumulated wealth, but in his commitment to honoring the lesson she had taught him about the true meaning of generosity. Their paths had diverged for 30 years, but now they stood together again, ready to create something new from the connection that had survived decades of separation and hardship. The debt that Marcus had carried since childhood was about to be transformed into a partnership that would help countless others discover their own capacity for resilience and compassion. The November evening settled over Manhattan, with the gradual dimming that marked winter's approach, streetlights beginning to flicker on, as office workers hurried toward subway entrances and taxi stands. The rain had finally stopped, leaving Park Avenue glistening under the amber glow of sodium lights, the air crisp with the promise of colder days ahead. Marcus stood beside Sophie's flower cart, his expensive overcoat still damp from their extended conversation in the rain, yet completely oblivious to his physical discomfort as his mind raced through possibilities that had suddenly transformed from 30 years of abstract longing into immediate, actionable reality. Sophie was carefully gathering the remaining flowers that had survived the day's weather, her movements efficient despite the obvious fatigue that came from hours of standing in the cold. Marcus watched her work with the same methodical precision he remembered from that Chicago alley, treating each damaged stem with respect that elevated the simple act of cleanup into something approaching ceremony. Even wilted daisies received her careful attention, as though their beauty persisted despite their commercial limitations. "Sophie," Marcus said suddenly, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who had been presented with an opportunity he couldn't afford to waste, "I want to help you immediately, tonight. You shouldn't have to go back to wherever you're staying when I have resources that could change everything for you right now." Sophie looked up from her flower arrangement, her expression showing the careful neutrality she had developed through years of navigating offers that might carry hidden costs or expectations. "What kind of help?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the direction his thoughts were taking. Marcus felt his words tumbling out with uncharacteristic lack of organization, driven by an emotional intensity that overwhelmed his usual strategic thinking. "Money, first of all. Enough to secure proper housing, to buy whatever you need immediately. I have apartments in Manhattan that are sitting empty, you could have one tonight, fully furnished, completely yours. And employment, obviously. I could create a position at Henley Enterprises that would utilize your intelligence and experience, something with a salary that would ensure you never have to worry about basic necessities again." The generosity of his offer was overwhelming in its scope and immediacy, Yet Sophie's expression grew more guarded rather than grateful as Marcus outlined the resources he was prepared to deploy on her behalf. She continued arranging flowers with deliberate care, using the familiar task to maintain composure while processing the implications of his proposal. "That's very generous," Sophie said carefully. "But I'm not looking for charity, Marcus. I built a life here that has dignity, even if it doesn't look like much from your perspective. I work for what I have, and that means something to me." Marcus felt frustration rising at her refusal, though he recognized that the emotion was complicated by his own need to resolve the debt he had been carrying for 3 decades. "This isn't charity," he insisted, though he wondered if that was entirely accurate. "You saved my life. Everything I've accomplished since that night exists because you chose to help a stranger when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose." Sophie's laugh carried no bitterness, but it revealed her skepticism about his characterization of their potential relationship. "Marcus, you were 12 years old when we met. I was 8. Neither of us understood the full implications of what was happening that night. You don't owe me a lifetime of gratitude for a moment of basic human compassion." The casual way she dismissed the magnitude of her childhood kindness struck Marcus as fundamentally wrong, a misunderstanding of the profound impact her actions had created. "You're not hearing what I'm trying to tell you," he said with growing intensity. "That night didn't just save my life, it changed everything about how I understand my responsibilities as someone with wealth and privilege." Marcus paused, recognizing that he needed to help Sophie understand the full scope of how their brief encounter had shaped his entire adult philosophy. The story required going back to the beginning, to the boy who had returned from Chicago with a different understanding of human nature and moral obligation. "When I got back to Ashford Prep after that night," Marcus began, "everyone expected me to be grateful for my rescue and ashamed of my rebellion. Instead, I was obsessed with understanding how someone with nothing could be more generous than people with everything. I started paying attention to things I had never noticed before: how the scholarship kids were treated differently, how service workers were ignored by students and faculty, how wealth created invisible barriers that separated people into different categories of worth." Sophie listened with the careful attention she brought to all serious conversations, though Marcus could see she was struggling to understand why his childhood insights should create adult obligations toward her specifically. Marcus found himself describing academic and personal discoveries he had never articulated so completely, revelations that had emerged gradually through years of education and experience, but which traced their origins to that December night in Chicago. "My senior thesis at Harvard was about corporate responsibility, but it was really about the lesson you taught me that real wealth comes from what you're willing to give away, not what you're able to accumulate." He described his unconventional career path, his insistence on working in sustainable development rather than immediately joining his family's business, his determination to understand poverty and inequality through direct experience rather than theoretical study. Each decision had been motivated by questions that originated in his encounter with Sophie. What obligations did privilege create? How could wealth be used to address rather than perpetuate inequality? What did it mean to live responsibly when surrounded by abundance that others would never experience? "I spent 2 years in Bangladesh implementing microfinance programs," Marcus continued, "living in conditions that would have been luxurious compared to what you faced as a child, yet still challenging enough to give me perspective on survival and resourcefulness. Every project I designed, every business strategy I developed, was influenced by trying to understand how someone like you develops the strength to share what you can't afford to lose." Sophie had stopped arranging flowers entirely. Her attention focused completely on Marcus's account of how their brief encounter had rippled forward through decades of decisions that affected thousands of people around the world. For the first time since their reunion began, she seemed to grasp the full scope of his gratitude and the genuine nature of his claim that he owed her something beyond conventional debt. "But Marcus," she said slowly, "if that night influenced your entire career and philosophy, then you've already honored what happened between us. You've used whatever inspiration you gained to help other people. That's more than enough repayment for a moment of childhood kindness. Marcus shook his head, recognizing that Sophie still didn't understand the fundamental nature of what he was trying to explain. You're thinking about this as though repayment is possible. As though there's some calculation that could balance what you gave me against what I might give you in return. But that's not how it works. He moved closer to her cart, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation remained private despite the pedestrians who continued to hurry past. Sophie, you didn't just save my life that night. You saved my soul. Without your example of generosity in impossible circumstances, I would have become exactly the kind of person my father expected: wealthy, successful, and completely indifferent to the suffering of people who couldn't contribute to my advantages. The emotional intensity of Marcus's words seemed to penetrate Sophie's defenses in ways that his offers of material assistance had not. She studied his face with new understanding, perhaps beginning to comprehend that his gratitude was about something more profound than simple reciprocity. I've carried the memory of your kindness for 30 years, Marcus continued, and it's guided every important decision I've made about how to use wealth and influence. Now I'm asking you to help me extend that guidance to other people who are facing the circumstances you've navigated with such extraordinary grace. Sophie was quiet for several minutes, her hands unconsciously smoothing the petals of a damaged rose while her mind processed the implications of Marcus's revelation. The November air was growing colder as evening deepened, yet neither of them seemed aware of the temperature or the urban chaos surrounding their intense conversation. I need to tell you something, Sophie said finally, her voice carrying a vulnerability that hadn't been present in their earlier exchange. That night in Chicago when I found you in the alley, it wasn't just about helping a stranger who was in trouble. Marcus waited patiently for her to continue, sensing that Sophie was about to reveal something significant about her own experience of their encounter. I had been living on the streets for 6 weeks, Sophie continued, and I was starting to lose hope that I could survive much longer. The cold, the hunger, the constant fear was wearing me down in ways that an 8-year-old shouldn't have to endure. I was beginning to think that maybe giving up would be easier than continuing to fight for survival. The confession struck Marcus with unexpected force, revealing that Sophie's state of mind that night had been far more desperate than her actions had suggested. He had remembered her as a confident angel appearing to save him, but now he understood that she had been struggling with her own version of despair. Finding you gave me purpose, Sophie said quietly. For the first time since my parents died, I felt like I could make a difference in someone else's life. Helping you reminded me that I had value beyond just surviving, that I could contribute something meaningful to the world, even when I had nothing material to offer. Marcus felt his breath catch as he realized the profound irony of their situation. He had spent 30 years believing that Sophie had saved him through her selfless generosity, never understanding that their encounter had been equally important for her emotional survival. She had needed to feel useful and valuable just as desperately as he had needed physical warmth and protection. You gave me hope, Sophie continued, that kindness still mattered in a world that had shown me mostly indifference and cruelty. Knowing that I could help someone, that my actions could prevent another person from experiencing the loneliness and terror I was feeling, made my own suffering seem more bearable. The revelation transformed Marcus's understanding of their relationship from simple debtor and benefactor to something far more complex and mutual. They had saved each other that night, though in different ways and perhaps without fully comprehending the emotional exchange that was occurring alongside the physical assistance. So, you see, Sophie said with a slight smile, your gratitude is based on incomplete information. I didn't help you purely out of altruism. I helped you because I needed to believe that I still had something valuable to contribute to the world. Marcus shook his head, rejecting her attempt to diminish the significance of her actions. That doesn't change anything about what you did. If anything, it makes your generosity more remarkable. You were facing your own crisis, yet you chose to focus on someone else's needs instead of being paralyzed by your own circumstances. Sophie considered this perspective with characteristic thoughtfulness, perhaps beginning to understand that her revelation hadn't reduced Marcus's gratitude, but had actually deepened his appreciation for the complexity of her character and circumstances. We shaped each other, Marcus said with sudden clarity. That night created something between us that's bigger than either individual memory or obligation. You showed me what courage and generosity looked like under impossible circumstances. I gave you an opportunity to rediscover your own capacity for making a positive difference. We both carried something forward from that encounter that influenced everything that came after. The realization seemed to resonate with Sophie in ways that Marcus's earlier offers of assistance had not. For the first time since their reunion began, she looked at him with something approaching acceptance of his desire to help, though he could see she was still struggling with the implications of his proposed partnership. "If I agree to work with you," Sophie said slowly, "it has to be as an equal partner, not as someone you're rescuing or repaying. I won't accept help that makes me feel like a charity case or an object of pity." Marcus felt hope blooming in his chest as he recognized that Sophie was finally engaging seriously with his proposal. "Of course. That's exactly what I want, a partnership between two people who understand something important about human nature and moral responsibility that most people never learn." Sophie studied his face with the careful attention she had learned to apply to all potentially life-changing decisions. What would this partnership actually look like? What would I be expected to contribute? And what kind of authority would I have over how programs are designed and implemented? Marcus felt his excitement building as he began to articulate the possibilities that had been forming in his mind since the moment he recognized her. You would help design initiatives based on your understanding of what actually works versus what sounds good in theory. You would have veto power over any program that doesn't respect the dignity of the people it's trying to serve. Most importantly, you would help me understand how to use wealth and influence in ways that create genuine opportunity rather than just temporary relief. The specific nature of his proposal seemed to address Sophie's concerns about maintaining agency and dignity within their potential partnership. Marcus could see her mind working through the practical implications, calculating whether his offer represented genuine collaboration or sophisticated charity disguised as equal partnership. "I'd want to start with programs I understand," Sophie said carefully. Job training for people transitioning out of homelessness, microfinance for small businesses like flower vendors, educational scholarships for non-traditional students who are working while attending school. Things where I can contribute real expertise rather than just inspirational narrative. Marcus nodded enthusiastically, recognizing that Sophie's specific suggestions demonstrated both practical wisdom and deep understanding of the populations they would be trying to serve. "Exactly. We start with programs where your experience provides genuine competitive advantage, then expand as we learn what works and what doesn't." As their conversation continued, Marcus found himself describing corporate structures and resource allocation strategies that would ensure Sophie's authority within their partnership, while Sophie offered insights into program design that immediately improved his preliminary ideas. The collaboration felt natural despite their vastly different backgrounds, as though their complementary perspectives on wealth, poverty, and human motivation created synergies that neither could achieve independently. "There's something else I need you to understand," Marcus said as their discussion of practical details began to wind down. "This partnership isn't something I'm creating to resolve my guilt or satisfy my gratitude. It's something I need to create, because you're the only person I've ever met who truly understands both the potential and the responsibility that come with having resources others lack." Sophie looked puzzled by his statement. "I don't understand wealth or privilege, Marcus. I've spent my entire adult life trying to achieve basic financial stability." "But you understand something more important," Marcus replied. "You understand what it means to make choices about sharing resources when sharing creates personal risk. Most wealthy people give away money that they'll never miss, from accounts that have more than they could spend in several lifetimes. You gave away protection you couldn't afford to lose, when losing, it might have meant the difference between surviving and not surviving." The distinction seemed to resonate with Sophie, perhaps helping her understand why Marcus valued her perspective so highly, despite her lack of formal education or professional credentials. "I've spent 30 years trying to figure out how to be generous in ways that actually matter," Marcus continued. I've donated millions to charities, funded scholarship programs, implemented corporate responsibility initiatives that have helped thousands of people. But I've never been able to replicate the kind of meaningful sacrifice you made that night, giving away something you desperately needed because someone else needed it more." Sophie was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the idea that her childhood experience of scarcity had provided her with insights that Marcus's lifetime of abundance had not. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that poverty had taught lessons about generosity that wealth had failed to provide. "If we do this," Sophie said finally, "I need you to promise that you'll listen when I tell you that a program isn't working or that an approach isn't respectful of the people we're trying to help. Wealthy people often have wonderful intentions, but they sometimes design solutions that make them feel good without actually addressing the root causes of problems." Marcus felt deep satisfaction at her conditional acceptance. Recognizing that Sophie's concerns about maintaining authenticity and effectiveness were exactly what their partnership needed to avoid the kind of well-intentioned failures that characterized many philanthropic initiatives. "I promise," he said solemnly. "More than that, I promise to learn from you about how to use resources in ways that create genuine opportunity rather than just temporary relief. You'll have authority to override any decision I make if you believe it compromises the integrity of what we're trying to accomplish." As the evening grew darker and colder around them, Marcus and Sophie continued refining their understanding of the partnership they were creating, moving from abstract gratitude and obligation toward concrete collaboration that would honor both their shared history and their individual expertise. The flower cart that had served as the site of their reunion was gradually becoming the foundation of something neither had anticipated but both recognized as inevitable. "I have one more confession," Sophie said as their conversation began to reach natural conclusion. "I didn't just help you that night because I needed to feel useful. I helped you because I recognized something in your face that reminded me of myself, someone who was lost and frightened and didn't understand how the world had suddenly become so dangerous." Marcus felt tears welling in his eyes as he understood that Sophie had seen past his expensive clothes and privileged background to recognize their shared humanity. Even at 8 years old, she had possessed the emotional intelligence to perceive that suffering transcended socio-economic categories. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly, the words carrying the weight of 30 years of gratitude that had finally found its proper expression. "Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what it means to see clearly in circumstances that would blind most people to everything except their own needs." Sophie smiled, with the same gentle warmth he remembered from that December night, her expression suggesting that their reunion had resolved something important for her as well. "Thank you for remembering," she replied, "and for caring enough to spend 30 years trying to honor something that lasted only one night." As they stood together beside her modest flower cart, surrounded by the relentless energy of Manhattan's financial district, Marcus and Sophie had transformed their chance encounter into the foundation of a partnership that would extend their mutual influence far beyond what either could achieve independently. The debt that could never be repaid had become the gift that would keep giving, creating ripple effects that would touch thousands of lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The girl who had saved a stranger's life with her only blanket had become a woman whose wisdom about dignity and resilience would help reshape how corporate resources addressed human suffering. The boy whose life she had saved had become a man whose wealth and influence would amplify her insights into solutions that honored both practical needs and human dignity. Their paths had diverged for 30 years, but now they converged again with purpose that transformed individual gratitude into collective possibility. The recognition that they had shaped each other's lives, more than either had previously understood, created the foundation for shaping countless other lives in ways that would honor the profound connection forged in a Chicago alley during the longest, coldest night of both their lives. 6 months after their reunion outside Henley Tower, Marcus stood in the marble-floored lobby of what had once been a struggling community center in Harlem, watching as construction workers put finishing touches on the bronze plaque that would officially dedicate the building. The Sophie Chen Foundation for Youth Empowerment occupied 3 floors of the renovated structure, its modern offices and program spaces a testament to what could be accomplished when resources met wisdom, when privilege partnered with lived experience. Sophie emerged from the elevator, carrying a stack of files, her appearance transformed not just by the professional clothing that replaced her weather-beaten jacket, but by something more fundamental, a confidence that came from rediscovering purpose and possibility that circumstances had forced her to abandon years earlier. The designer suit she wore had been purchased not as charity but as necessary equipment for someone whose responsibilities now included testifying before congressional committees and presenting program models to international development agencies. "The Chicago delegation just confirmed," Sophie told Marcus, consulting her tablet with the efficiency that had made her indispensable to the Foundation's operations. 43. Mayors want to implement our model in their cities. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is offering matching funds for any municipality that adopts our comprehensive approach. Marcus felt the familiar surge of pride that accompanied Sophie's professional achievements, yet it was tempered by amazement at how quickly she had adapted to responsibilities that would have overwhelmed most people regardless of their educational background. In 6 months, she had designed program curricula, hired and trained staff, established partnerships with universities and corporations, and created evaluation metrics that satisfied both skeptical academics and demanding federal agencies. The transformation had begun the morning after their reunion. When Marcus had arrived at Sophie's small apartment with legal documents establishing the Sophie Chen Foundation and naming her as its director with complete operational autonomy. The endowment, initially $50 million, though Marcus had privately committed much more as programs expanded, had been structured to ensure Sophie's authority over all programming decisions while providing resources that could address homelessness and poverty on a scale neither had previously imagined. "I won't be a figurehead," Sophie had insisted during their first formal planning meeting, held in a conference room at Henley Enterprises, while architects designed the Foundation's permanent headquarters. "If my name is on this organization, I need real control over how it operates and serves people." Marcus had not only agreed, but had insisted on legal structures that made Sophie's authority unassailable, even by him. The Foundation's board included social workers, former homeless individuals, policy experts, and corporate leaders, but Sophie retained veto power over any decision that might compromise the dignity or effectiveness of their programs. The first initiative they had launched, transitional housing combined with job training and educational support for youth aging out of foster care, had drawn on Sophie's understanding of the specific challenges facing young people without family networks or financial resources. Unlike traditional programs that offered temporary shelter or brief job training, the Sophie Chen Foundation provided comprehensive support for up to 3 years, including psychological counseling, educational scholarships, and ongoing mentorship from adults who had successfully navigated similar transitions. The key insight, Sophie had explained to a conference of social workers from across the country, is that aging out of care isn't a discrete event. It's a process that requires sustained support through multiple challenges that don't follow convenient timelines. Housing, education, employment, emotional stability, they're all interconnected, and programs that address them separately usually fail. The Foundation's model had attracted national attention within months of its implementation, partly because of the impressive outcomes they were achieving, but also because of the unusual partnership between Marcus and Sophie that powered the organization. When journalist Margaret Chen from the Washington Post, no relation to Sophie, though the coincidence had provided an easy opening for their first major interview, had investigated the Foundation's funding and leadership structure, she had uncovered the extraordinary story of their childhood encounter and 30-year separation. "Billionaire CEO credits homeless girl for his success" had been the headline that launched their story into national consciousness, though Marcus had insisted the focus remain on the Foundation's work rather than their personal history. In the interview, he had been characteristically direct about the source of his motivation. Sophie Chen saved my life when I was 12 years old, then spent the next 30 years living in circumstances that should never exist in a wealthy society. This foundation isn't charity, it's long overdue recognition that she's been an expert on poverty and resilience her entire life. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, with reporters seeking interviews and documentary filmmakers requesting access to their programs. Sophie had initially been uncomfortable with the publicity, concerned that focus on their personal story might overshadow the Foundation's work. But Marcus had convinced her that their visibility could accelerate adoption of their model by other cities and organizations. People need to see that effective solutions come from understanding lived experience, he had argued during one of their strategy sessions. Your credibility as someone who has actually navigated these systems gives our programs authority that purely academic approaches can't achieve. The publicity had indeed accelerated their impact, leading to invitations from universities wanting to study their methods, corporations seeking to fund expansion of their programs, and government agencies requesting consultation on federal policy changes. Sophie had discovered that her decades of survival experience translated remarkably well to public speaking and policy advocacy, her authentic understanding of systemic barriers providing compelling arguments for the comprehensive approaches the Foundation advocated. More personally significant for Sophie had been the opportunity to complete her interrupted education. Marcus had quietly arranged for her acceptance at Columbia University's School of Social Work, where her life experience had been recognized as equivalent to the prerequisite coursework usually required for advanced study. The program allowed her to maintain her foundation responsibilities while gaining formal credentials that enhanced her credibility with academic and policy audiences. I never thought I'd be sitting in graduate seminars at an Ivy League university, Sophie had confided to Marcus during one of their weekly dinners, a tradition they had established to maintain their personal friendship alongside their professional partnership. Sometimes I feel like I'm pretending to belong in those classrooms. Marcus had understood her imposter syndrome, having experienced similar feelings during his own privileged education despite his vastly different circumstances. You belong there more than most students, he had assured her. You're not studying poverty and homelessness as abstract theories, you're bringing real expertise to academic discussions that usually lack practical grounding. The validation of Sophie's insights had come through multiple channels. The Foundation's programs consistently achieved better outcomes than traditional approaches. Federal agencies had begun incorporating their methods into national policy recommendations, and international organizations had requested consultation on addressing urban poverty in developing countries. 2 years after their reunion, Sophie stood before an audience of 500 at the National Conference on Youth Homelessness, delivering a keynote address that would be broadcast to social workers and policymakers in 43 countries. The transformation from flower vendor to nationally recognized expert had been remarkable in its speed. Yet Marcus understood that Sophie's authority came not from rapid advancement, but from decades of accumulated wisdom that circumstances had finally allowed her to apply. Effective intervention requires understanding that homelessness isn't a housing problem, it's a relationship problem. Sophie told the audience, her voice carrying the confidence that came from speaking truth validated by experience. Young people need more than shelter and job training. They need adults who believe in their potential and provide consistent support through inevitable setbacks and challenges. The standing ovation that followed her speech included representatives from organizations across the country that had already begun implementing variations of the Sophie Chen Foundation model. Marcus watched from the back of the auditorium, feeling pride that was complicated by ongoing amazement at Sophie's natural ability to articulate insights that educated professionals had somehow missed. The Foundation's programs had expanded beyond their initial focus on foster care transitions to include services for homeless veterans, job training for formerly incarcerated individuals, and educational scholarships for non-traditional students. Each new initiative drew on the same fundamental principle that Sophie had insisted on from the beginning: respect for the dignity and intelligence of people facing difficult circumstances, combined with comprehensive support that addressed interconnected challenges rather than isolated symptoms. The flower cart that had served as the site of their reunion had been donated to the Smithsonian Institution as part of an exhibit on American entrepreneurship and resilience. In its place, the Sophie Chen Foundation operated 7 youth centers across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, with additional locations planned for Chicago, Los Angeles, and 12 other cities where municipal governments had committed to supporting their comprehensive model. Marcus had sometimes wondered whether their rapid success might be creating unrealistic expectations or attracting attention that could compromise the foundation's core mission. But Sophie's insistence on rigorous evaluation and continuous improvement had maintained their credibility with skeptical academics and demanding funders. Every program was assessed not just for immediate outcomes, but for long-term impact on participants' stability, self-sufficiency, and ability to help others facing similar challenges. "We're not just trying to solve individual problems," Sophie had explained to a delegation of European social policy experts visiting their Harlem headquarters. "We're trying to create a model that recognizes resilience and expertise in populations that society usually writes off as damaged or hopeless." The most profound validation of their approach had come through the stories of program participants who had not only achieved stability but had become advocates and mentors for others. Maria Santos, now 22, had aged out of foster care 3 years earlier and graduated from the Foundation's first transitional housing program. She was currently completing her bachelor's degree in social work while serving as a peer counselor for newer program participants. "The Foundation saved my life," Maria had testified at a congressional hearing on federal funding for youth services. "But more importantly, it taught me that my experience surviving difficult circumstances gave me knowledge that could help other people. I'm not just a former homeless person who got lucky. I'm a professional who specializes in supporting youth transitions because I understand them from the inside." Stories like Maria's had multiplied across all the Foundation's programs, creating a network of alumni who served as mentors, employees, and advocates for expansion of their model to other cities and populations. The ripple effects of their work had begun generating their own momentum, with former participants starting complementary organizations and implementing similar approaches in communities where the Foundation didn't yet operate. On a crisp October morning 3 years after their reunion, Sophie stood at the podium in Columbia University's Lowe Memorial Library, addressing an audience of 63 young adults who were graduating from various Sophie Chen Foundation programs. The ceremony had been designed to recognize not just academic achievements, but the courage and determination required to overcome circumstances that would have defeated many people. Marcus sat in the audience beside Richard and Elizabeth Henley, his parents having become unexpected advocates for the Foundation after witnessing the impact of their son's partnership with Sophie. Richard, initially skeptical of what he had considered Marcus's idealistic tendencies, had gradually come to appreciate the business acumen Sophie brought to nonprofit management and the measurable outcomes their programs achieved. In the corporate world, Richard had admitted to Marcus during a recent family dinner, "We would call Sophie a turnaround specialist, someone who takes failing systems and redesigns them for success. The fact that she's applying those skills to social problems doesn't make her work less impressive." Elizabeth Henley had been even more enthusiastic about Sophie's impact, volunteering her time as a mentor in the Foundation's educational scholarship program and serving on the board of advisors that helped guide their expansion into new cities and populations. Sophie began her graduation address by acknowledging the unique nature of the ceremony. "Traditional graduations celebrate academic achievement," she said, "but today, we're celebrating something more fundamental: your determination to continue growing and learning despite circumstances that society often treats as disqualifying." She spoke of the specific challenges each graduate had overcome: homelessness, poverty, family dysfunction, educational interruption, employment discrimination, and the psychological trauma that often accompanied systemic disadvantage. Yet her tone was celebratory, rather than sympathetic. emphasizing the strength and wisdom that difficult experiences had provided rather than focusing on the suffering they had endured. You are graduating today not despite your difficult experiences, but because of the resilience and insight those experiences have given you, Sophie continued. You understand things about survival, adaptability, and human nature that privileged people often never learn. That knowledge makes you valuable not just as individuals who have overcome obstacles, but as professionals who can help others navigate similar challenges. Marcus felt his eyes filling with tears as he watched Sophie address the graduates with authority that came from shared experience rather than academic theory. Many of the young adults in the audience had backgrounds similar to hers: foster care, homelessness, interrupted education, periods of despair when continuing to fight for better circumstances had seemed pointless. Yet here they were, graduating from college programs, completing job training certifications, and preparing to enter careers that would allow them to support themselves while helping others. The keynote speaker who followed Sophie was Dr. Patricia Williams, the psychology professor who had taught Sophie during her brief time at Harold Washington College nearly 20 years earlier. Dr. Williams had tracked Sophie's career with amazement, having recognized exceptional potential in a student whose circumstances had prevented her from completing her degree at that time. When I taught Sophie Chen in 1996, Dr. Williams told the audience, I saw a brilliant young woman whose insights into human behavior were remarkable for someone her age. But the economic pressures that forced her to withdraw from school seemed to end her educational journey before it could really begin. Dr. Williams described her amazement at learning about Sophie's work with the Foundation, her completion of graduate study at Columbia, and her emergence as a nationally recognized expert on poverty and homelessness. Sophie's story demonstrates that intelligence and wisdom don't follow traditional timelines. She explained, sometimes the most important education happens through lived experience that can't be replicated in any classroom. The ceremony concluded with each graduate being called forward to receive certificates recognizing their specific achievements, while also receiving personalized gifts that Sophie had selected based on her knowledge of their individual goals and interests. For Maria Santos, who would be starting her master's degree in social work the following semester, Sophie presented a leather portfolio engraved with the Foundation's motto, "Strength through experience, service through understanding." As the graduates and their families moved to a reception in the library's rotunda, Marcus approached Sophie with the gratitude that had become a constant element of their relationship. "Watching you tonight," he said, "I understand something I didn't fully grasp when we first reunited. The girl who saved my life 30 years ago was already the woman who could transform how society addresses poverty and homelessness. The experience and wisdom were there, you just needed the opportunity to apply them." Sophie smiled with the warmth that had characterized their friendship since their reunion, though Marcus could see that his words had touched something deeper than professional pride. "I needed to believe that my experiences had value beyond just surviving them," she admitted. "Working with these young people has taught me that trauma and hardship can become sources of strength and insight if they're honored rather than dismissed." 5 years later, Marcus stood in the same Columbia rotunda, now addressing an audience of Foundation staff members, board members, and policymakers who had gathered to celebrate the opening of the organization's 50th location. The Sophie Chen Foundation had become a model replicated across 4 countries, its comprehensive approach to addressing homelessness and poverty recognized by the United Nations as a best practice for urban development. Sophie, now Dr. Sophie Chen, after completing her doctoral dissertation on lived experience as professional expertise in social services, served as the Foundation's international director while also teaching graduate courses at Columbia's School of Social Work. Her textbook, Beyond Charity, Dignity, Based Approaches to Poverty Intervention, had become required reading in social work programs across the country. "When Sophie and I reunited outside my office building," Marcus told the anniversary audience, "I thought I was finally getting the opportunity to repay a debt I had carried for 30 years. What I discovered was that repayment wasn't possible because what Sophie had given me couldn't be measured in money or material assistance. He described the ongoing impact of their partnership, not just through the Foundation's direct services, but through the broader influence their model had created. Cities across the country had revised their approaches to homelessness based on principles the Foundation had demonstrated. Federal agencies had adopted their methods as standard practice. International organizations had requested consultation on applying their insights to refugee assistance and disaster relief. But the most important impact, Marcus continued, can't be measured in statistics or budget allocations. It's the transformation of how we understand the relationship between privilege and responsibility, between having resources and using them wisely. Marcus concluded his remarks by introducing a video presentation featuring former Foundation participants who had gone on to create their own organizations, pursue advanced education, and become advocates for policy changes that addressed root causes of poverty rather than just its symptoms. The video included messages from mayors, social workers, academics, and business leaders who had implemented variations of the Sophie Chen Foundation model in their own communities and organizations. The presentation ended with footage from the Foundation's most recent graduation ceremony, where Sophie had addressed an audience that included not just program participants but their children, young people who had grown up with stable housing and educational opportunities because their parents had received comprehensive support during critical transitions. The intergenerational impact of their work was becoming visible, as children who might have repeated cycles of poverty and homelessness instead entered kindergarten with the advantages that stable families could provide. As the anniversary celebration concluded, Marcus and Sophie stood together on the steps of Lowe Memorial Library, looking out over a campus where Sophie now taught graduate students and conducted research that influenced policymakers around the world. The flower vendor who had struggled to survive in Manhattan's unforgiving economy had become an internationally recognized expert whose insights shaped how societies addressed their most vulnerable populations. "Sometimes I think about that night in Chicago," Sophie said as they walked toward the cars that would take them to dinner with Foundation staff and board members. Two children who had no idea that their brief encounter would eventually touch thousands of lives in ways neither of us could have imagined. Marcus nodded, still amazed by the trajectory that had brought them from that snowy alley to this moment of recognition and influence. "The ripple effects are still expanding," he observed. "Every young person who graduates from our programs, every policy that gets changed because of our advocacy, every organization that adopts our methods, they're all extensions of what you started when you chose to share your blanket with a stranger." 10 years after their reunion, the Sophie Chen Foundation had directly served over 12,000 individuals while influencing policy changes that affected millions more. The organization's alumni network included social workers, teachers, nurses, business owners, and political advocates who had transformed their survival experiences into professional expertise and community leadership. Sophie's doctoral research had demonstrated that programs designed by people with lived experience of poverty and homelessness achieved significantly better outcomes than those created by professionals who understood these issues only through academic study. Her findings had influenced federal funding priorities and university curriculum requirements, ensuring that future social workers would receive training that honored the expertise of the populations they served. The flower cart that had served as the symbol of Sophie's struggles had inspired a network of microenterprise programs that helped low-income individuals start small businesses with comprehensive support and mentorship. What had begun as Sophie's individual survival strategy had evolved into a systematic approach to economic empowerment that cities across the country had adopted as part of their poverty reduction initiatives. Marcus had restructured Henley Enterprises to incorporate the social responsibility principles that Sophie had helped him articulate, creating a corporate model that measured success not just through profit margins, but through impact on communities and employees. The company's approach to sustainable development and inclusive hiring practices had influenced other corporations to examine their own relationships with the communities where they operated. On a spring morning 15 years after their reunion, Sophie stood before an audience of 2,000 at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., delivering a speech as the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The ceremony recognized her contributions to social policy and her role in transforming how American society addressed poverty and homelessness. Marcus sat in the audience beside Sophie's husband, Dr. James Mitchell, a fellow social worker whom she had met during graduate school and married 5 years earlier. Their daughter, 8-year-old Elena, sat between them, listening with serious attention as her mother described the journey from childhood homelessness to national recognition. "The lesson I learned 30 years ago in a Chicago alley," Sophie told the audience, "is that human dignity transcends circumstances, and that every person possesses knowledge and strength that society needs but often fails to recognize. My work has simply been about creating systems that honor those truths." She spoke of the thousands of young people who had graduated from foundation programs, the policy changes that had resulted from their advocacy, and the network of organizations that had adopted their dignity-based approach to social services. But she also emphasized that individual stories of transformation mattered more than aggregate statistics or policy achievements. When a young person ages out of foster care and discovers that their survival experiences have given them valuable insights for helping others, we don't just change one life. We create a ripple effect that can influence entire communities, Sophie explained. Every graduate of our programs becomes a demonstration that resilience and wisdom can emerge from circumstances that society usually treats as purely negative. The standing ovation that followed her speech included representatives from organizations across the world that had implemented variations of the Sophie Chen Foundation model. Marcus watched with pride that was deepened by ongoing amazement at Sophie's ability to articulate insights that transformed how people understood the relationship between adversity and strength. 20 years after their reunion, Marcus and Sophie stood together in the same Harlem neighborhood where the foundation had established its first headquarters, now presiding over the dedication of the Sophie Chen University Center for Applied Social Innovation. The facility, funded through a partnership between Henley Enterprises and Columbia University, provided graduate education specifically designed for students with lived experience of the social problems they sought to address. The center's inaugural class included former homeless individuals pursuing doctoral degrees in social policy, former foster youth studying nonprofit management, and former victims of domestic violence earning credentials in trauma counseling. The curriculum combined traditional academic rigor with explicit recognition that lived experience constituted legitimate expertise that enhanced, rather than replaced, formal education. Sophie, now in her 50s and serving as the center's founding director, had continued to expand the foundation's influence while also becoming a mentor to younger advocates who were applying similar principles to other social issues. Her protégés included formerly incarcerated individuals who designed criminal justice reform programs, former refugees who led international development initiatives, and former addicts who created comprehensive addiction treatment approaches. "The philosophy hasn't changed since that night in Chicago," Sophie explained to a journalist documenting the center's opening. "We still believe that people who have navigated difficult circumstances possess wisdom that society needs, and that effective solutions come from honoring that expertise rather than dismissing it." Marcus, now serving as CEO of Henley Enterprises, while maintaining his role as the foundation's board chair, had become a leading advocate for corporate social responsibility models that measured success through community impact rather than just shareholder returns. His business practices had influenced other executives to examine how their companies could contribute to, rather than exploit, the communities where they operated. The ripple effects of their partnership had extended far beyond direct service provision to include fundamental changes in how American society understood poverty, resilience, and the relationship between privilege and responsibility. Universities had revised their social work curricula. Federal agencies had adopted new funding priorities, and corporations had implemented hiring practices that recognized non-traditional forms of expertise and experience. On a winter evening, 25 years after their reunion, Sophie stood before an audience of 500 at the Foundation's annual gala, now held at the Lincoln Center to accommodate the international attendance the event attracted. The evening celebrated the graduation of the 10,000th participant from Foundation programs, while also announcing the establishment of similar initiatives in 23 countries where local organizations had adapted their model to different cultural and economic contexts. Marcus watched from his seat at the head table as Sophie described the global network of organizations that had grown from their initial partnership in Manhattan. Representatives from programs in Kenya, Bangladesh, Brazil, and 15 other countries had traveled to New York to share how they had implemented dignity-based approaches to addressing poverty and displacement in their own communities. "When I was 8 years old, living in a Chicago alley," Sophie told the audience, "I learned that sharing what you can't afford to lose doesn't make you poor, it makes you more human." Tonight, we celebrate the thousands of people who have discovered that their survival experiences contain wisdom that can help others navigate similar challenges. The evening's keynote speaker was Dr. Elena Mitchell Chen, Sophie's daughter, now 23 and completing her doctoral dissertation on intergenerational trauma and resilience. Elena's research, built on her mother's work, while extending it to examine how family stability created by comprehensive support programs influenced outcomes for children who might otherwise have repeated cycles of poverty, disadvantage. "My mother's work demonstrates that individual acts of kindness can become systematic approaches to social change," Elena told the audience. "But more importantly, it shows that every person who overcomes difficult circumstances becomes a resource for helping others achieve similar transformations." As the gala concluded with performances by artists who had been supported through the Foundation's cultural programs, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from that chance encounter in the rain to this moment of international recognition and influence. The debt that could never be repaid had become a gift that continued giving, creating opportunities and transformations that neither he nor Sophie could have imagined when they first reunited outside Henley Tower. 30 years after a homeless 8-year-old girl had shared her father's blanket with a freezing stranger, the Sophie Chen Foundation operated programs in 47 countries, had directly served over 50,000 individuals, and had influenced policy changes that affected millions more. The organization's model had become the international standard for dignity-based approaches to poverty intervention, recognized by the United Nations as a best practice for sustainable development. Sophie's academic work had fundamentally changed how social services were designed and delivered, while Marcus's corporate leadership had demonstrated that businesses could achieve financial success while prioritizing community impact and social responsibility. Together, they had created a partnership that honored both the practical wisdom earned through difficult experience and the resources that privilege could provide when guided by genuine understanding of human dignity and potential. The flower cart that had once represented Sophie's struggle for survival had become a symbol of transformation that adorned Foundation offices around the world, reminding staff members and participants that dignity and purpose could emerge from the most challenging circumstances. The blanket that had saved Marcus's life remained in his office, now serving as inspiration for business decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of customers across the global enterprises he directed. But perhaps most importantly, the connection forged between two children in a Chicago alley had demonstrated that individual acts of kindness, when honored and extended through intentional partnership, could create ripple effects that transformed not just individual lives, but entire systems of how societies understood their obligations to their most vulnerable members. As Sophie and Marcus stood together on the Lincoln Center steps after the gala, surrounded by Foundation staff members and program alumni from around the world, they represented something unprecedented in the relationship between privilege and social responsibility. A true partnership that had transformed both personal gratitude and systemic obligation into collaborative action that continued expanding its influence with each passing year. The girl, who had given away her only protection to save a stranger, had become a woman whose wisdom shaped international approaches to poverty and human development. The boy whose life she had saved had become a man whose resources amplified her insights into solutions that honored both practical needs and human dignity. Together, they had proven that the distance between a homeless child's act of kindness and a global movement for social justice was measured not in years or geography, but in the determination to transform individual compassion into systematic change that recognized the expertise and potential present in every human being, regardless of their circumstances. The debt that could never be repaid had become the gift that would never stop giving, creating opportunities and transformations that would continue rippling forward through generations of young people who would never have to choose between surviving and thriving, between accepting society's limitations and discovering their own extraordinary potential for resilience, wisdom, and service to others.